Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. Part of me still thinks nobody will believe me. Hell, I wouldn't believe me. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. This happened last summer when I went hiking with my friends Tyler, Megan, and Dave in the Cascade Mountains. We're all experienced hikers. I've been doing it since I was a kid, but nothing prepared me for what we encountered that day. We started early, around 6 in the morning. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, slight breeze, clear skies. We'd been on this particular trail a few times before, so we weren't worried about getting lost. It's about 15 miles round trip, with some challenging terrain, but nothing extreme. We packed light, just water, energy bars, first aid kit, and I brought my dog Ranger, a German Shepherd mix, who loves these trips as much as we do. Everything was completely normal for the first few hours. We were joking around, taking photos of the scenery, pointing out interesting plants. Ranger was running ahead and coming back to check on us, his usual routine. We stopped for lunch around 11, sitting on some fallen logs about 7 miles in. That's when things started to feel different. I remember feeling this weird sensation first, like the forest had suddenly gone quiet. You know how woods normally have this constant background noise, birds, insects, rustling leaves, it all just stopped. I didn't mention it right away, thinking maybe it was just me being paranoid. But then Tyler said, "Is it just me or did everything get really quiet?" We all kind of looked at each other, and that's when we heard it for the first time. I still struggle to describe this sound accurately. It was like a deep, drawn-out noise that was somewhere between a scream and a moan, but not high-pitched like you'd expect from a scream. It was low, guttural, with this weight to it that made the hair on my arms stand up. It carried through the trees in a way that didn't seem possible, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Dave immediately said, "What the hell was that? Mountain lion." But I've heard mountain lions before, and this wasn't it. This was something else entirely. Ranger's reaction was what really freaked me out. He's a brave dog. He's chased bears off our property before. But he immediately tucked his tail between his legs and pressed himself against my leg, whimpering. He was terrified. We stood there, frozen, trying to figure out where the sound had come from. Megan whispered, "Should we head back?" And I was about to agree when Tyler pointed to our left and said, "Guys, look." About 30 yards away, partially hidden behind a massive pine tree, was a head, just a head, peering out. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. But no, the proportions were all wrong. This thing had a heavy brow ridge, and its skin, or fur, I couldn't tell from that distance, was dark, almost black. The eyes were what got me, though. They were deep set in the face, and they were just staring at us. Not with aggression or fear, just observing. For what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds, we all just stood there, locked in this bizarre staring contest with whatever this was. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. I remember thinking I should grab my phone to take a picture, but I couldn't make my hands work. It was like my body knew that any sudden movement would be a mistake. Then, without any warning, it just turned and ran. That's when I got my first full look at it. It was moving on 2 legs, upright like a human, but the way it moved was all wrong. It was fast, way faster than any person could run through dense forest. And while it wasn't super tall, maybe around 6 feet, it was wide, like impossibly wide. The shoulders and back were just massive, solid looking. It disappeared into the thicker part of the forest within seconds. We all started talking at once. Megan was saying we should leave immediately. Dave was convinced it was someone in a suit playing a prank. Tyler was just repeating, "What the fuck?" over and over. I was trying to calm Ranger down, who was now barking like crazy in the direction the thing had gone. I said we should continue our hike, partly because I didn't want to admit how scared I was, and partly because going back would mean potentially crossing paths with whatever that was again. The others reluctantly agreed, but the mood had completely changed. We weren't talking or joking anymore. Every few minutes, one of us would stop and listen, and Ranger stayed right by my side instead of running ahead. About an hour later, we heard the sound again, that same moaning scream, but this time it seemed to come from somewhere up ahead of us. It was louder this time, more prolonged. We all stopped dead in our tracks. Ranger started growling, which was somehow worse than when he was scared. Tyler said, "I think it's following us." That's when I noticed Megan was crying silently. I've known her for years, and I'd never seen her cry before. She's usually the toughest one in our group. We decided to go off trail to avoid whatever was making that sound. Dave had a compass, so we figured we could cut through the forest for a bit and then find our way back to the trail further ahead. In hindsight, this was a terrible decision, but fear doesn't exactly sharpen your judgment. The forest got denser as we moved away from the trail. We had to push through underbrush, climb over fallen trees. At one point, I got separated from the others for maybe 2 minutes, and that was the most terrified I've ever been in my life. When I found them again, I noticed Tyler had picked up a large branch and was carrying it like a weapon. We eventually found a small clearing and stopped to get our bearings. Dave was checking his compass when we heard something moving in the trees around us, not just from one direction, but from multiple points, like we were being circled. Ranger was spinning in circles, barking at the trees, not knowing which direction to focus on. I remember saying, "We need to get back to the trail now." Nobody argued. As we started moving again, I spotted something that still haunts me. About 50 yards away, through a gap in the trees, I saw not one, but 2 of these figures standing completely still, watching us. One was the same size as what we'd seen earlier, but the other was smaller, maybe 5 feet tall. They were partially obscured by foliage, but I could make out their outlines clearly. The same wide builds, the same posture that was almost human, but not quite right. I nudged Tyler and pointed silently. He saw them too. He gripped my arm so hard it left bruises that lasted for days. We quickened our pace, trying not to run outright because the terrain was too dangerous for that, but moving as fast as we safely could. The whole time, we could hear them moving parallel to us, keeping pace easily. Sometimes branches would crack to our left, sometimes to our right. Occasionally we'd catch glimpses, just dark shapes moving between trees, always staying just at the edge of visibility. We finally made it back to the trail after what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes. The relief was overwhelming, but short-lived. As soon as we got back on the trail, we heard that sound again, that moan scream. But this time, it came from right behind us, maybe only 20 yards back. It was so loud it felt physical, like it was vibrating in my chest. We ran. We just flat out ran down that trail, not caring about twisting an ankle or falling anymore. Ranger was right beside me, matching my pace. I remember thinking that if I fell and broke my leg, they would get me. I didn't know who they were or what they would do, but I was certain I didn't want to find out. We ran until our lungs were burning, and then we kept running. Finally, we had to stop because Megan was hyperventilating. We paused just long enough for her to catch her breath, and that's when Dave pointed out that we hadn't heard anything for the past 10 minutes. No moans, no footsteps, nothing following us. We kept moving at a fast walk after that, constantly checking behind us. The sun was starting to get lower in the sky, which added a new level of panic. None of us wanted to be in those woods after dark. When we finally reached the trailhead and saw our car sitting there, I almost cried from relief. We piled in, and Dave, who was driving, had us out of there before we even had our seatbelts on. The ride back was mostly silent. What do you say after something like that? It wasn't until we were about halfway home that Tyler finally spoke up. That was a Sasquatch, wasn't it? Like an actual fucking Bigfoot. None of us responded right away. I think we were all processing the fact that we'd encountered something that isn't supposed to exist. I don't know what it was, I finally said. But whatever it was, there was more than one of them. We've only talked about it a few times since then. Dave still tries to rationalize it, says it could have been other hikers playing a prank, or maybe bears that were walking upright for some reason. But his explanations have too many holes, and I can tell he doesn't even believe them himself. Tyler, Megan, and I know what we saw. Those weren't humans, and they weren't any known animal. The way they moved, the sounds they made, the intelligence in their eyes. It was something else entirely. I haven't been hiking since. I can't bring myself to go back into the woods, even different woods. Ranger still gets anxious whenever we're near dense trees. His ears go back, and he stays glued to my side. The weirdest part? About 3 weeks after our hike, I was letting Ranger out in our backyard. I live at the edge of town with forest behind my property, and I heard it again. That same moan scream, coming from the trees beyond my fence. It was around 5 in the morning, still dark out. Ranger refused to go outside for a week after that. I don't know if they followed us home somehow, or if these things are just more common than people realize. All I know is that something is out there in the woods, watching, following, aware of us in a way that feels too intelligent, too deliberate to be animal curiosity. I still have nightmares about those eyes staring at me from behind the tree, and sometimes, when I'm home alone at night, I swear I can hear heavy footsteps circling my house. Story 2. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. I'm a wildlife biologist with 15 years of field experience, and what I saw last August goes against everything I was taught in my scientific training. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. I was leading a small team conducting a protected species survey in Ocala National Forest in Florida. It was supposed to be a routine 5-night expedition. We do these surveys several times a year to monitor endangered plants and animals. My team included Jake, an experienced field technician, and Melissa, a graduate student working on her thesis. Both are level-headed professionals I've worked with before. The first night was uneventful. We set up our base camp near the western edge of the forest, did some preliminary daytime surveys, and planned our routes for the next few days. Nothing unusual. It was on the second night that things started getting weird. We were doing nocturnal surveys, basically hiking predetermined transects while recording any wildlife observations. Around midnight, we heard this strange vocalization coming from about half a mile away. It was a series of whooping sounds that started low and rose in pitch before trailing off. "What was that?" Melissa asked, stopping in her tracks. I shined my headlamp in the direction of the sound. Not sure, maybe a barred owl with a weird call. But it didn't sound like any owl I'd ever heard. We all stood there listening as it repeated 3 more times, then went silent. Jake shook his head. "That's no owl. Doesn't match any wildlife I know. I've spent thousands of hours in the field. I know what bobcats, panthers, coyotes, and all the native birds sound like. This was different. We marked it in our notes as an unidentified vocalization and continued our survey. On the third night, we found something disturbing. We were checking a different area about 2 miles from our previous location when we came across a section of forest where small saplings and undergrowth had been systematically flattened or broken. It covered an area maybe 15 feet in diameter. The vegetation wasn't just trampled. Some small trees were snapped about 4 feet up from the ground. "Bears?" suggested Melissa, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. I knelt down to examine the damage. "I don't think so. No claw marks on the trees, no hair, no scat, and bears don't typically snap trees like this unless they're after something specific." "Could be humans," Jake offered. "Maybe hunters setting up some kind of blind." That made more sense. but still didn't feel right. The breaks in the wood were fresh, sap was still oozing. And why would anyone come this far into the forest to break a bunch of trees and then leave? We were at least 3 miles from the nearest road or trail. By the 4th night, we were all on edge. We'd heard the whooping sound 2 more times, always distant, always at night. We found another area of broken vegetation about a mile from the first site. This time, there was a clear path leading away from the damaged area, like something large had pushed through the underbrush. "I don't like this," Jake muttered as we recorded our observations. He'd been getting increasingly jumpy, constantly scanning the tree line with his flashlight. "Let's stick together tonight," I suggested. "No splitting up for parallel transects." That night passed without incident, but none of us slept well back at camp. I kept waking up, thinking I heard heavy footsteps outside my tent. By morning, I was exhausted and starting to question myself. Maybe we were all just getting spooked by normal forest sounds. The 5th night is when it happened. It was our final night of surveys, and we were checking an area near a dirt service road that cuts through that section of the forest. It was around 2:30 in the morning. The night was clear with a quarter moon, so visibility wasn't terrible once your eyes adjusted. We were moving quietly along our transect, documenting some fox tracks we'd found, when Jake suddenly grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "Look," he whispered, pointing toward the road about 50 yards ahead of us. At first, I didn't see anything. Then something moved at the edge of the trees, something big. "What is that?" Melissa's voice was barely audible. I fumbled for my binoculars, but before I could get them focused, it stepped fully into the open. My heart nearly stopped. Walking across the dirt road on 2 legs was the largest bipedal creature I've ever seen. It was at least 7 feet tall, maybe closer to 8, with an incredibly broad chest and shoulders. Its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, hanging down almost to its knees. The entire body was covered in coarse, dark hair, almost black, but with a slight brownish tint, visible even in the moonlight. "Holy shit," Jake breathed beside me. The thing moved with a smooth, powerful stride, not lumbering like you might expect from something so large. Its legs were thick and muscular, and with each step, I could see the muscles in its back and shoulders shift under the hair. It wasn't running, just walking purposefully across the road. Melissa started to raise her camera, but I put my hand over it. Some instinct told me we shouldn't draw attention to ourselves. When it reached the middle of the road, the creature suddenly stopped and turned its head in our direction. I still don't know if it heard us or smelled us, but in that moment, I felt like my heart would explode. Its face was less hairy than the rest of its body, a dark brownish skin tone with a pronounced brow ridge, and its eyes, God, its eyes caught the distant reflection of our headlamps and glowed a dull reddish color for just a second. We froze completely. I wasn't even breathing. The creature stood motionless for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it simply turned away and continued across the road. There was a large fallen pine on the other side, at least 3 feet in diameter. The creature stepped over it effortlessly, barely breaking stride, and disappeared into a thick stand of palmetto. None of us moved for at least a minute after it was gone. When I finally found my voice, it came out as a croak. "Did you both see that?" They nodded, their faces pale in the moonlight. "That wasn't a bear," Melissa whispered. "Bears don't walk like that." "And it wasn't a person in a suit," Jake added. "Nobody could fake that movement. And the size, Jesus." We debated what to do next. The scientific part of my brain was screaming to follow it, to gather evidence. But a more primal instinct was telling me to get the hell out of there. We compromised. We waited about 10 minutes, then cautiously approached the road. The dirt was soft from a recent rain, and there they were, footprints, large, human-like footprints, at least 16 inches long and 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. The stride length between them was over 4 feet. I've been around plenty of large men in my life, and none of them leave prints like these. Jake took out a small ruler we use for track measurements and placed it next to one print for scale. Melissa snapped several photos. I knelt down to examine them more closely. The impressions were deep. Whatever made them was heavy. We followed the tracks to where the creature had crossed the fallen pine. On the other side, we found a freshly made path through the palmetto thicket. Small branches were broken and fronds were pushed aside. The vegetation was so dense that I couldn't see more than a few feet along the path. "Should we follow it?" Melissa asked, her voice shaking slightly. I considered it briefly, but shook my head. "No, it's moving too fast, and we don't know where it's headed. It's not worth the risk." We finished documenting the tracks and the path, then headed back to camp. None of us slept that night. We packed up at first light and were out of the forest by 9 in the morning. The drive back to the university was mostly silent. Finally, Jake spoke up. "So what do we tell people?" It was the question I'd been asking myself all morning. As scientists, we're supposed to report our observations objectively. But I also knew what would happen if we officially reported seeing a Sasquatch during a survey. "Let's stick to the facts," I said finally. We observed an unidentified large mammal. We documented tracks and disturbances to vegetation. We took photographs of the evidence. "But we're not going to say what we think it was," Melissa stated. "It wasn't a question. Not in the official report," I agreed. "When we got back, we downloaded the photos. The footprints were clear enough, but without something in the frame for scale, they could be dismissed as unusually shaped bear tracks. We had no photos of the creature itself. I've spent the last few months trying to make sense of what we saw. I've gone over every possible explanation. Bear with mange walking upright, someone in a costume, a collective hallucination due to exhaustion. None of them fit what we experienced. I've been a wildlife biologist for 15 years. I've studied large mammals across North America. I know what bears look like when they stand up. I know what humans look like in the woods. What we saw wasn't either of those things. The way it moved through that forest, with such effortless power and silent precision, haunts me. No human could navigate dense vegetation that smoothly in the dark. No bear moves with that kind of bipedal gait. Whatever it was, it belonged in those woods in a way that we didn't. I'm still processing what this means for my understanding of the natural world. I've always been skeptical of Sasquatch reports. Now I don't know what to think. All I know is what I saw, and I can't explain it. Has anyone else had an experience like this in Ocala or anywhere else? I need to know I'm not losing my mind. Story 3. I never thought I'd ever write this out, but I can't keep it to myself anymore. What happened that evening in October 2004 still gives me nightmares, and I need to put it out there, even if no one believes me. I live in a small house that sits about 50 yards from the edge of Sproul State Forest in western Pennsylvania. It's beautiful here, peaceful, quiet, and most of the time, I love the isolation. My closest neighbor is almost half a mile away, and the forest basically serves as my backyard. I've always been comfortable with this setup until that night in late October nearly 20 years ago. It was around 6:30 in the evening, just after sunset, when I decided to take my dog, Rusty, for our usual walk. He was a golden retriever mix, about 4 years old at the time, energetic and always eager for our evening strolls. We had this dirt road that ran alongside my property before it curved and disappeared into the forest. It was our regular route. The air was crisp that evening, with that distinct fall chill that makes your cheeks flush. I remember wearing my dad's old flannel jacket over a sweater because the temperature had dropped faster than expected. The sky still had that dusky blue color, but it was getting darker by the minute. I brought a flashlight, but wasn't using it yet, just letting my eyes adjust naturally as daylight faded. Rusty was doing his usual thing, sniffing around, running ahead a bit, then waiting for me to catch up. We were maybe 10 minutes into our walk when I got this weird feeling. You know that sensation when you suddenly realize something's different but can't immediately put your finger on what it is. The forest just felt off. I stopped and looked around, scanning the tree line that ran parallel to the dirt road. That's when I saw it. At first I thought maybe it was a dead tree I hadn't noticed before. There was this dark shape at the edge of the woods, maybe 50 yards away, just standing there. But I walked this path almost every day, and I knew there wasn't any tree that tall or shaped like that in that spot. As my eyes adjusted more to the growing darkness, I realized with absolute horror that what I was looking at wasn't a tree at all. It was something, someone, standing upright. My first rational thought was that maybe a hunter was out there, but even from that distance I could tell this thing was massive, way too big to be a person. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, probably more, with an incredibly thick build, and it was completely covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. I froze. Rusty hadn't noticed it yet. He was busy investigating something in the grass a few feet ahead of me. I remember my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I was trying to process what I was seeing, while simultaneously telling myself I had to be mistaken. But then I saw its eyes. Even from that distance, I could make out this strange orangish glow. Not like a reflection you'd see from a deer or other animal when light hits their eyes. This was different. The glow was steady, consistent, even though there wasn't any direct light hitting it. Those eyes were fixed directly on me. I didn't know what to do. I was too scared to run, thinking that might provoke it. So I just started walking again, moving slowly, trying to act normal while my insides were churning with fear. I called Rusty to stay close to me, keeping my voice as steady as possible. That's when things got even weirder. As I walked, the creature moved too. It kept pace with me, walking parallel along the tree line, never coming closer but never backing away either. When I stopped, it stopped too, and would turn its body to face me directly, just watching. I tried this a few times, walking then stopping, and every single time it did the same thing. It was clearly observing me, tracking my movements intentionally, and it was definitely bipedal. It never dropped to all fours, always maintaining that upright posture that made it look so unnervingly human-like, despite its size and the hair covering its body. The longer this went on, the more details I could make out. Its shoulders were incredibly wide, and its arms looked longer than a human's should be, hanging down past where its knees would be. The hair or fur covering it was dark, black or maybe very dark brown, and seemed to be all over its body. I couldn't make out facial features beyond those glowing eyes, but the silhouette of its head seemed to blend right into its shoulders, like it barely had a neck. I'm not sure how long this bizarre stalking game went on, probably only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. My mind was racing through all the possibilities. Was it a bear standing on its hind legs? No, bears don't walk like that continuously. A person in a costume. Out here, miles from anywhere, in the growing darkness. And no costume could account for that height and build. That's when it hit me. Everything about this thing matched descriptions I'd heard of Bigfoot. I'd always rolled my eyes at those stories, but standing there, watching this massive creature mirroring my movements, I couldn't deny what I was seeing. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to stuff them in my pockets. I was trying to figure out what to do, keep walking and hope it would lose interest. Turn around and head back to the house. I was afraid that any sudden movement might cause it to charge at me. Then Rusty finally noticed it. He had been happily exploring, completely oblivious until that moment. Suddenly, his body went rigid. The hair on his back stood up, and he let out this low growl I'd never heard from him before. It wasn't his usual alert bark or warning growl. This was deeper, more primal. He was terrified. That's when I lost it. Seeing my normally brave dog so frightened pushed me over the edge. I called out, "Rusty, let's go," and we both started running back toward the house. I didn't even look back at first. I was just focused on getting to safety as quickly as possible. The dirt beneath my feet felt uneven and treacherous as I ran. My flashlight beam was bouncing wildly, barely lighting the path ahead. Rusty was right beside me the whole time, matching my pace instead of running ahead like he normally would. It was like he was afraid to leave my side. When I was about 100 yards from my house, I finally risked a glance over my shoulder. My blood went cold when I saw that the creature was still there, still at the edge of the trees, still watching. It hadn't chased us, thank God, but it hadn't left either. It was just standing there, its massive silhouette unmistakable against the darker backdrop of the forest. I practically fell up the steps to my front porch, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. Once inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it, then leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. Rusty was pacing nervously, whining in a way I'd never heard before. After a few minutes of trying to calm down, I moved to the window that faced the forest. The creature was still there, at the exact same spot where I'd last seen it, standing motionless at the tree line. It had to be at least 200 yards away now, but I swear I could still make out those glowing orange eyes staring toward my house. I called my dad, who lived about 20 minutes away. I was crying and probably not making much sense, but he could tell I was genuinely terrified and said he'd come right over. While waiting for him, I kept checking the window. The creature remained in the same position for at least 10 more minutes. Then, just a few minutes before my dad arrived, I looked out and it was gone. I scanned the entire tree line, but there was no sign of it. It had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. When my dad got there, I tried to explain what I'd seen. He took his rifle and went outside to look around, but of course there was nothing to find. I could tell he didn't believe me. He thought I'd seen a bear, or maybe just gotten spooked by shadows in the growing darkness. He stayed the night anyway, sleeping on my couch to make me feel safer. In the days that followed, I checked the area for footprints or any other evidence, but the ground was too hard and covered with fallen leaves to show anything conclusive. I told a few friends about what happened, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Eventually, I just stopped talking about it, but I know what I saw. That was no bear, no man in a costume, and definitely not my imagination. Whatever that creature was, it was intelligent enough to deliberately mirror my movements, to observe me with clear intent and purpose. I still live in the same house, and I still walk that dirt road sometimes, though never alone and never after dark. I'm constantly scanning the tree line, watching for any sign of that massive silhouette. It's been almost 20 years, and I've never seen it again. But the memory of those glowing orange eyes is as fresh as if it happened yesterday. Every time I hear a twig snap in the forest at night, every time the wind makes the trees move in a certain way, I'm right back in that moment, watching something impossible watching me. I don't know what it wanted or why it appeared that one time and never again, but I know it was real, and I know it's still out there somewhere in those woods. So if you're ever hiking near Sproul State Forest and get that feeling of being watched, that prickling sensation on the back of your neck, you might not be alone. Just pray that whatever's watching you is content to keep its distance, like it did with me. Story 4. I've been debating for months whether to share this. My friends think I'm crazy, and honestly, I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I need to tell someone who might understand what I saw that day in the woods. This happened back in October of 2003. I was 21 and struggling to balance college with hunting season. Any hunter knows how frustrating it is when classes overlap with the best time to be in the woods, especially in fall when the deer are moving. I just finished my afternoon classes and figured I had enough daylight left to squeeze in a couple hours before dark. I drove my beat-up Chevy up this backcountry road I'd been to dozens of times before. Nothing special about the area, just public land about 40 minutes from campus with decent deer activity. The spot had this nice elevated view of a valley, and I'd had luck there before. I parked at this small trailhead, grabbed my rifle, Remington 30-06 my dad gave me when I turned 16, and hiked about half a mile to this clearing that overlooked the valley. Weather was perfect, cool but not cold. Maybe low 50s with just a slight breeze, the kind of afternoon when you can smell the pine and fallen leaves. Sun was already getting low, maybe 3 hours till sunset. I set up at the edge of this field where I could glass the valley below. There was an old construction site down there. Someone had started building a house and barn maybe 5 years back, but ran out of money. The foundation and frame were there, but it was mostly just weathered wood and concrete footings now. The area around it had grown up with brush and small trees. Through my binoculars, I spotted a small group of deer, 4 or 5 of them, bedded down in some scattered trees about 300 yards away. I remember thinking it was weird they weren't moving around much. Usually at that time of day, they'd be getting up to feed, but these deer were dead still, like they were listening for something. I kept watching them for maybe 15 minutes, planning my approach. The wind was in my favor, so I figured I could work my way down this game trail and get within 100 yards for a clean shot. That's when I heard it. This loud crashing sound came from near that half-built house, not like a deer moving through brush. This was heavy, like something big was plowing through the undergrowth. My first thought was black bear. We get them around here sometimes, and they make a racket when they move. I swung my binoculars toward the sound, scanning the edge of the tree line. That's when I saw it, and I swear on everything I care about, it wasn't a bear. This thing was dark, completely black, or maybe really dark brown, and it was moving on 2 legs, not stumbling or awkward like a bear might stand up momentarily. This thing was walking smoothly, quickly, pushing through some of the densest brush I've ever seen, and it wasn't slowing down at all. My hands started shaking so bad I had to lower the binoculars and take a breath. I thought maybe it was another hunter, but no way. This thing was massive, way taller and broader than any person I've ever seen, and the way it moved. No human moves like that through thick brush. It was just powering through vegetation that would have stopped me even with a machete. I raised my binoculars again, trying to get a better look. The creature was about 200 yards away now, moving parallel to my position. I still couldn't see its face clearly, but I could make out these long arms that swung with each stride. Not like a person's arms. These were longer, more powerful looking. Its whole body seemed covered in the same dark color. No clothes, no gear, nothing that would indicate it was human. What freaked me out most was how it entered this patch of buckbrush that was so thick you couldn't walk through it. This brush is nasty stuff, dense, thorny, practically impenetrable. But this thing just pushed straight through like it was nothing, never breaking stride. I've hunted these mountains my whole life, and I've never seen anything move through terrain like that. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I've had close encounters with bears and even a mountain lion once, but I've never felt fear like this. It wasn't just being startled, it was this deep, primal feeling that something was very wrong. Like my whole body was screaming at me to get out of there. I chambered around in my rifle. The sound seemed impossibly loud in that moment. My hands were sweating so bad I was worried about dropping it. I kept my eyes fixed on where the creature had disappeared over a ridge, backing away slowly toward the trail. Those deer I'd been watching earlier, they were gone, vanished without a sound. That's when I realized how quiet it had gotten. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just complete silence except for my own breathing. I didn't run. Everything I know about predators tells you not to run, but I moved as fast as I could while still watching that ridgeline. When I got back to my truck, I threw my gear in, hands fumbling with the keys so bad I dropped them on the floorboard. I kept checking my mirrors the whole drive home, this sick feeling in my stomach like I was being followed. It's been years, and I still can't explain what I saw. It wasn't a bear. I've seen plenty of bears, and they don't move like that. It wasn't a person in a suit. No one could navigate that terrain at that speed, especially not in some bulky costume. The proportions were all wrong for a human anyway. Too big, too powerful. My uncle and cousins still hunt that area. They think I'm being ridiculous when I refuse to go back. I've tried telling them what I saw, but they just laugh it off. Probably just a bear, they say, or maybe you were more tired than you thought after class. But I know what I saw. I still hunt, but never alone anymore, and never in that valley. I carry a bigger rifle now too, upgraded to a .338 Winchester Magnum. Some guys give me crap about it being overkill for deer, but it's not the deer I'm worried about. The thing that bothers me most is the movement. Whatever this was, it moved through that landscape with absolute confidence, like it owned those woods. No hesitation, no caution, just raw power. Nothing I've encountered before or since has moved with that kind of authority through such difficult terrain. Sometimes I'll be sitting in my blind, perfectly still, and I'll get this feeling on the back of my neck, like something's watching me from just beyond where I can see. I'll catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turn, there's nothing there. Just shadows and trees. I've researched online, read accounts from other hunters, tried to find something that matches what I saw. Some stories come close. Descriptions of dark figures moving through the woods, unusually large bipedal, but nothing quite captures the fluid, powerful way this thing moved. My girlfriend thinks I should talk to someone about it, like a therapist or something. She doesn't say it, but I can tell she thinks I imagined it or exaggerated what I saw. But how do you exaggerate something that defies explanation? I know what a bear looks like. I know what people look like, even at a distance. This wasn't either. I went back once, about a year later, with my dad and uncle. Broad daylight, middle of summer, 3 of us armed. We walked down to that half-built house. The whole time I felt sick to my stomach, jumpy at every sound. We found nothing. No tracks, no hair, no sign anything unusual had been there. But I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. That buckbrush I mentioned? My uncle wanted to check it out after I told him how the creature moved through it. We couldn't get more than a few feet in before the thorns stopped us. It would have taken hours with tools to cut a path through what this thing traversed in seconds. I don't tell many people about this anymore. The few I've told either think I'm messing with them or that I mistook something ordinary for something extraordinary. But here's the thing. I've spent my whole life in these woods. I know what belongs there and what doesn't. Last fall, I was hunting a completely different area, about 50 miles from that valley. I was with my buddy Mark, sitting in a blind near dusk. We heard this sound. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, coming from a ridge about a mile away. Mark said it was probably coyotes, but coyotes don't sound like that. It was deeper, more guttural, and it echoed through the trees in a way that made both of us go quiet. Mark didn't say anything else about it, but I noticed he was quick to suggest we head back to the truck once the light started fading. Neither of us mentioned that sound on the drive home. I still hunt those mountains. I still love being in the woods, but that day changed something fundamental in how I see the wilderness. There's a wildness out there that goes beyond what most people understand. Something that exists in the spaces between what we know and what we don't want to know. I've tried to convince myself it was just a bear, or maybe even a moose, though they're rare in that area. But then I remember how it moved, upright, purposeful, powerful, and I know better. Whatever I saw that October afternoon wasn't something that shows up in hunting magazines or wildlife documentaries. Sometimes I wonder if it knew I was watching, if it sensed me the same way I sensed it, if it chose to let me see it, crossing that open space when it could have stayed hidden. That thought keeps me up some nights. I don't have proof, no photos, no footprints, nothing but my memory of those few minutes, but I know what I saw, and I know those woods aren't just ours. If you've seen something similar, you already know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, well, keep your eyes open when you're out there, and maybe carry a bigger rifle than you think you need. Story 5. I've always considered myself pretty level-headed. My husband David and I are experienced hikers who've spent years exploring backcountry trails across Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado. We know what wildlife sounds like. We've heard coyotes, wolves, bears, mountain lions, you name it. So when I tell you what happened on our second night in our new home in Fairfield County, please understand, I'm not someone who jumps at shadows or makes up stories for attention. We moved to South Carolina about a week ago, near the tiny community of Blair. The property was exactly what we wanted. Affordable, secluded, with gorgeous trees and no neighbors in sight. Just us, backing right up to dense forest that stretches for miles. The realtor mentioned something about the previous owners moving rather suddenly, but the price was right, and we were excited about our fresh start away from city life. May 8th started out perfectly normal. We spent most of the day unpacking boxes and arranging furniture. Our two dogs, Ranger and Sadie, were loving the space to run around outside, and our cats had already claimed their favorite windowsills. After dinner, David and I decided to enjoy a glass of wine on the back porch. The evening was warm with that heavy southern humidity we're still getting used to. Around 9:30, I heard what I initially thought was an owl somewhere in the trees behind our property. I didn't think much of it at first, just part of the country soundscape. But within minutes, the sound changed. It got louder, much louder, and then I realized it wasn't just coming from one direction. "Do you hear that?" I asked David, who had been scrolling through his phone. He looked up, listening. "Yeah, weird owl." "That's not an owl," I said, feeling the first tingle of uneasiness crawl up my spine. "Listen to how deep it is." The sound was like a drawn-out hoo, but with a guttural quality that no bird could produce. It was coming from the tree line, maybe 100 yards behind our house. Then another similar call answered from the south side of our property, then another from the north. David put his phone down and sat forward. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, not wanting to talk too loudly. Something about those sounds made me want to be quiet, to not draw attention to ourselves. We sat listening as the calls continued. They weren't random. There was a pattern to them. One would call, then another would answer, then the third. Sometimes they'd overlap slightly. The sounds were similar but distinct enough that we could tell there were at least 3 different, whatever they were. Ranger and Sadie, who had been lounging on the porch with us, suddenly got up. I expected them to start barking or at least alerting to the sounds, but instead they both retreated to the corner of the porch, furthest from the woods, tails tucked, ears flat. These are dogs who've faced down coyotes without flinching, and now they were cowering. "It's not coyotes," I said, stating the obvious. "Not wolves either." "Could be some kind of local wildlife we don't know about," David suggested, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Around 10 o'clock, I noticed something else disturbing. The normal nighttime chorus had stopped. No crickets, no frogs, nothing but those rhythmic, deep, hooting calls echoing through the trees. I reached for David's hand without looking at him, my eyes fixed on the dark wall of trees. The forest is too quiet. As if responding to my observation, one of the calls changed. It came faster, sharp, forceful whoops that almost sounded like speech, like someone trying to mimic words without knowing the language. My skin prickled with goosebumps despite the warm evening. "Let's go inside," David said, standing up. The movement seemed to trigger a reaction. All 3 sources of the sound started calling at once, louder than before. We hurried inside, bringing the dogs with us. The cats were nowhere to be seen. Later I found them hiding in the small storage space in the attic, as far from the outside walls as they could get. From the kitchen window, we continued to listen. The calls persisted, and now it seemed like one of them was moving. The sounds from the south were getting closer to the house. I pulled the curtains closed, suddenly not wanting to look outside anymore. "Should we call someone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Animal control or something?" David shook his head. "And tell them what?" "That we're hearing weird noises. They'd laugh at us." He was right, but it didn't make me feel any better. We tried watching TV to distract ourselves, but I couldn't focus on anything except those sounds. Around 11, I thought I heard something on the back porch. A soft scraping noise, like something dragging across the wooden boards. David grabbed a flashlight and his hunting knife from the drawer. He flipped on the porch light and peered through the blinds. "Nothing there," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. The sounds continued past midnight. One of them, the one that had been moving closer, was now making those speech-like whoops right at the edge of our yard. I could swear it was responding to our movements inside the house. When David walked from the living room to the kitchen, the whoops would follow along the windows, tracking him. "It knows we're in here," I whispered. "It's watching us." "That's ridiculous," David said, but he kept away from the windows after that. Around 1 in the morning, I heard a sharp crack from outside, like a large branch breaking underfoot. Immediately after, there was a series of rapid calls, different from the pattern we'd been hearing all night. It was faster, more urgent, almost like a warning. Then silence, complete silence, that felt even more threatening than the sounds had been. We waited, barely breathing, for several minutes. Nothing. "Maybe they're gone," David said hopefully. I didn't think so, but I nodded anyway. We were both exhausted and on edge. We decided to try to get some sleep, though neither of us suggested going to our bedroom, which faced the backyard. Instead, we stayed on the living room couch, keeping the lights on. I must have dozed off at some point because I jerked awake to a sharp tapping on the kitchen window. 3 distinct taps, like knuckles on glass. David was asleep beside me. The digital clock on the cable box read 3:17. Tap, tap, tap. Again, on the window. I shook David awake. "There's something at the window," I hissed. Before he could respond, the tapping moved to the back door, then to the side window, then back to the kitchen. Whatever it was moving around our house, trying each entry point. The dogs, who had been huddled together on their bed in the corner, started whining, not barking, whining in fear. David grabbed his phone. "I'm calling the police." Just as he said that, the tapping stopped. Then came a new sound, a low, rumbling growl so deep I could feel it vibrating through the floorboards. It didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard. It sounded angry. The call to the police was embarrassing. They said they'd send someone out, but I could tell from the dispatcher's tone that they weren't taking us seriously. By the time a deputy arrived 45 minutes later, the sounds had stopped completely. The officer walked around our property with a flashlight, looking bored. He found nothing except some disturbed ground near the back porch steps, which he attributed to our dogs. He suggested it might have been coyotes, or maybe some kids from town playing pranks. "Not much else out here that makes noise like that," he said with a shrug. "I've lived in Blair my whole life. We get weird sounds in these woods sometimes. You'll get used to it." But I knew he was wrong. Whatever made those sounds wasn't anything natural, and I certainly wasn't going to get used to it. The next morning, exhausted from almost no sleep, David went into the small town center to get groceries and talk to locals. I stayed home, too afraid to be alone, but also too afraid to leave our pets. In daylight, I forced myself to go out to the back porch. The woods looked innocent enough, just trees and underbrush, but something caught my eye near where the officer had noticed disturbed ground. Stepping closer, I saw what looked like a partial footprint in the soft earth. It was large, much larger than David's boot, and oddly shaped, with what appeared to be only 4 toes. I took a picture with my phone, my hands shaking. When David returned, he had information that made my blood run cold. At the general store, when he casually mentioned hearing strange sounds in the night, several locals exchanged knowing looks. One older man pulled him aside. "Most folks around here call them wild dogs and leave it at that," the man had told David. "But those ain't no dogs. My daddy used to call them the woods people. Said they've been here longer than us. Best to leave them be and don't go looking." David showed me a local newspaper clipping the man had given him from 1998. A brief story about unexplained vocalizations in the forest that had prompted several families to report prowlers. The article was dismissive, attributing the sounds to wildlife or overactive imaginations. That night, we heard nothing, nor the next night. But something had changed. The woods behind our dream home no longer felt peaceful or welcoming. They felt like they were watching us, waiting. It's been 2 weeks now. The sounds haven't returned, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever made them is still out there. Sometimes in broad daylight, I'll be in the kitchen and suddenly feel like I'm being observed. I'll look up to see movement at the edge of the trees. Just a shadow or a swaying branch, but somehow deliberate. David says I'm being paranoid, that we just heard some unusual local wildlife our first night, and my imagination is running wild. He's already talking about the sounds less, trying to normalize our experience. But I know what I heard. Those weren't animal calls. They were communication. They were responding to us. They were coordinated. And whatever left that footprint by our porch was not a coyote or a bear or a human. I don't know how long we'll stay here. Part of me wants to pack up and leave tomorrow, but another part needs to know what's out there in those woods, what watches our house at night, what tapped on our windows. Last night, I woke up around 2 in the morning to find myself standing at the back door, my hand on the doorknob. I have no memory of getting out of bed or walking there, and outside, just at the edge of the tree line, I could swear I saw something tall and dark, standing perfectly still, watching our house. I'm writing this down because I need someone to believe me. Those weren't wild dogs or owls or kids playing pranks. Something lives in these woods that shouldn't exist. Something that can mimic speech, coordinate with others of its kind, and move silently enough to approach our house without being seen. And I think it's trying to get me to come outside. Story 6. I'm not someone who believes in the paranormal. Never have been. I consider myself pretty grounded. I'm an IT consultant. I deal with facts and logic for a living. But something happened last weekend that I still can't explain, and I need to get it off my chest. I joined this hiking group about 6 months ago to get more exercise and meet new people after my divorce. We're a mix of serious hikers and casual nature enthusiasts who meet twice a month to explore different trails around the state. Last Saturday, we decided to check out this old forest ranger station that's been abandoned since the 90s in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. The trip was actually planned because a couple members from our group had been there a week earlier and claimed they found what might be a Bigfoot footprint. I know, I thought it was ridiculous too. I actually joked about it with a few others during the drive up. I mean, I'm 37 years old and have never believed in Bigfoot or any of that stuff. I went along mostly because I needed to get out of the house and the weather forecast was perfect. We arrived at the trailhead around noon and hiked about 3 miles to reach the old building. It was actually a beautiful hike. Tall pines, hardly any underbrush, and this amazing earthy smell that you only get in old-growth forests. We reached the ranger station around 2 in the afternoon, and after dropping our packs on the porch, Jake, our unofficial group leader, took us to see the footprint. It was honestly underwhelming. Just a shallow impression in some soft dirt that could have been anything. A deer bedding spot, someone's boot mark that got rained on, whatever. It didn't look like a footprint to me, more like an area where the ground had been disturbed. Everyone was taking pictures and discussing it, but I wasn't impressed. I wandered off about 50 yards from the building to look around. The forest was pretty open there, tall trees but not much undergrowth, which gave good visibility. I was just scanning the ground, not really looking for anything in particular, when I noticed this dark shape off to my right, maybe 40 yards away. At first, I thought it was a stump or fallen log, but something about it caught my attention. It was low to the ground, like something crouching or sitting, and it was dark brown. I stared at it, trying to figure out what I was seeing, when I realized with a jolt that I was looking at a face. Not a human face. Not an animal face either, at least not any animal I've ever seen. I froze. I literally couldn't move. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I just stood there staring. and whatever it was stared back. This went on for what felt like forever, but was probably about 2 minutes according to my watch. Then it moved. Slowly, so slowly. It turned its head to the left, then to the right, and then directly at me again. I could see its features clearly even from that distance. It had 2 round eyes set deep under a thick, heavy brow ridge. Its nose was broad and flattened, almost like a gorilla's but different. The face was covered in dark brown hair, but I could see light brown or tan skin around the eyes and nose. The eyes themselves were black, not just dark, but completely black. I tried to take a step to the side to get a better angle, to confirm what I was seeing, and the moment I moved, the face just disappeared. Not like it ducked down or ran away. It was just gone. I blinked, and it wasn't there anymore. I called over to Miguel, who was the only person from our group who'd brought a thermal imaging attachment for his phone. He's really into wildlife photography. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked him to scan the area where I'd been looking. He did, turning slowly in a full circle, but shook his head. "Nothing, man, not even a squirrel," he said. The rest of the group decided to continue hiking another mile to a small waterfall, but I told them I needed to rest. The truth is, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, and I wanted to stay in the area a bit longer. I sat on the porch of the old ranger station as they headed out, promising to be back in an hour. Once they left, I suddenly remembered something else. Right after the face disappeared, I'd heard a sound, a kind of whistle. Not like someone whistling a tune, but a single, short note. And then, maybe 30 seconds later, I heard another whistle from much further to my left, like something was moving around me. At the time, my brain was so focused on processing what I'd seen that I barely registered the sounds. But sitting there alone, the memory came back clearly. I sat on that porch for maybe 20 minutes, replaying everything in my mind. My rational brain was trying to explain it away. A shadow, a deer, my imagination. But I knew what I'd seen. As I sat there, I started to develop this pounding headache. It came on suddenly, and with it, this strange feeling like my energy was draining away. I felt exhausted and almost dizzy. That's when I heard it. A deep, low sound, almost like a bullfrog's croak, but more intentional. It sounded like a single-syllable word, something like go or out. I couldn't tell exactly, but the message felt clear. I wasn't welcome there. I stood up quickly, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. The headache intensified, and I had this overwhelming urge to leave. I grabbed my backpack and started walking quickly down the trail toward where the others had gone. The farther I got from the ranger station, the better I felt physically, but mentally, I was a mess. I caught up with the group at the waterfall, but I couldn't focus on anything. Miguel asked if I was okay, and I just nodded and said I wasn't feeling well. I couldn't bring myself to tell them what happened, not right then. I was still trying to process it myself. When we got back to our campsite that evening, I found a piece of cardboard from one of the supply boxes and tried to sketch the face I'd seen. I'm not an artist, but I needed to get it out of my head and onto something tangible. As I was drawing, my hands started shaking, and I felt tears welling up. I don't cry easily. The last time was when my dad died 3 years ago, but something about trying to capture that face broke something loose inside me. I tossed the drawing into my tent and walked away from the campfire. I needed to be alone. I sat in my tent for about an hour, just staring at nothing, when Jake and Miguel came to check on me. They could tell something was wrong, and I finally told them what I'd seen. I expected them to laugh or at least look skeptical, but they didn't. Jake actually looked concerned, and Miguel nodded thoughtfully. "There are things in these forests that science hasn't explained yet," Jake said quietly. "You're not the first person to see something like this." We talked for another hour, and Jake shared some similar stories he'd heard from other hikers and from his uncle who'd worked as a forest ranger for 30 years. It helped somehow to know I wasn't alone in this experience. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my tent made me freeze. I kept seeing those eyes, that face, whenever I closed my eyes. The next morning, we packed up and headed home, and I've been trying to make sense of it ever since. I've spent hours researching online, looking at reports of similar sightings in the Pacific Northwest. Some descriptions match what I saw, others don't. What keeps haunting me is the intelligence I saw in those eyes. This wasn't just an animal. Whatever was watching me understood that I saw it, and it made a decision to leave. And that sound, that word, it felt like communication. I've always been skeptical of Bigfoot stories. I still am in a way. I don't know if what I saw was what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I just know it wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal. The proportions were wrong, the features were wrong, and the behavior was deliberate. The headache and drained feeling still bother me too. It wasn't normal. It felt external somehow, like something was affecting me physically. I've never experienced anything like that before or since. I haven't told anyone else about this, except my brother, who suggested I write it down. So here I am, trying to put into words something that still doesn't feel real. I keep questioning myself, wondering if my mind played tricks on me, but then I remember the absolute clarity of those moments. The face, the eyes, the sound. It was real. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that part of the forest. Part of me wants to confirm what I saw. Part of me is terrified at the thought. All I know is that my understanding of what exists in our world has been fundamentally shaken. There was something out there watching me, something intelligent that didn't want to be seen. The group is planning another hike next month, but not to the same area. I haven't decided if I'm going yet. When I close my eyes at night, I still see that face staring at me from the underbrush, and I hear that deep, resonant sound that seemed to say so clearly, "You don't belong here." Story 7. I've been debating whether to post this for months. Even typing it out now, my hands feel shaky. What happened last summer has completely changed how I feel about being outside after dark, especially anywhere remote. I'm not typically someone who scares easily. I've always loved hiking, camping, all that outdoorsy stuff. But now, I can barely walk my dog after sunset without feeling watched. This happened in June of 2022. My buddy Jake and I had spent the day fishing at this little spot we'd found a few years back in Perry County. It's pretty secluded, which is why we liked it. No crowds, just peace and quiet. We'd stayed later than planned because the fish were really biting that evening. By the time we packed up our gear, the sun had already set. Our cars were parked about 1.5 miles down this old gravel road. During the day, it's nothing special. Just a typical rural back road cutting through dense woods. But at night, that road feels different. Longer, darker, more isolated. We had our headlamps, but it was actually a really bright night with a nearly full moon, so we decided to save the batteries and just walk by moonlight. The gravel crunched under our boots as we made our way back, talking about normal stuff. The fish we'd caught, some new movie Jake wanted to see, just casual conversation to fill the silence. It must have been around 11 at night when I first noticed it. About 200 yards ahead, right in the middle of the road, was this dark shape. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just a fallen tree or maybe a big rock. The moonlight was creating all kinds of shadows, so I pointed it out to Jake almost casually. "What's that up ahead? Looks like something's blocking the road." Jake squinted. "Probably just a log or something. Want me to shine the light?" "Nah, we'll see it better when we get closer," I said, still not thinking anything was off. So we kept walking, our conversation dying down a bit as we both found ourselves staring at whatever was sitting there in the road. As we got closer, maybe 100 yards away, I started feeling uneasy. Something about the shape wasn't right. It was too uniform, too solid, and I swear it seemed bigger than it had a minute ago. That's when it happened. The shape moved, not like a small adjustment or a trick of the light. It rose up from what must have been a crouched position. I'll never forget watching it unfold itself, standing to its full height. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, maybe taller. The moonlight caught its outline, showing broad shoulders that had to be twice as wide as mine. I heard Jake's breath catch beside me. We both just stopped dead in our tracks. The thing, and I don't know what else to call it, turned toward us. It was still just a silhouette from where we stood, but I could see what looked like black fur covering its body. When it moved slightly, the fur seemed to shimmer or catch the moonlight in a way that made my skin crawl. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. I couldn't do either. My feet felt cemented to the ground, and my throat had closed up completely. I couldn't even whisper to Jake. We just stood there, frozen, staring at this impossible thing that was now fully facing us. Time stretched in a way I can't explain. What was probably only 20 seconds felt like hours. The creature and us, locked in this silent standoff in the middle of nowhere. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My mouth had gone completely dry. Then, with a casualness that was somehow more terrifying than if it had charged us, the thing turned away. It stepped off the road with a deliberate movement and walked into the tree line. Not rushing, not skulking, just walking steadily, like it had all the time in the world. The woods swallowed it up, but I swear I could still make out its massive shape moving between trees for several seconds before it disappeared completely. The moment it was gone, the spell broke. Jake grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises, and we both turned and ran back the way we'd come. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We just ran like hell, the gravel sliding under our feet, both of us nearly falling multiple times, but somehow staying upright. We made it back to the fishing spot and huddled by the water's edge, finally catching our breath enough to speak. What the fuck was that? Jake's voice was barely a whisper. I shook my head. I don't know. I don't know. It wasn't a bear. Jake said this with such certainty that I looked at him. His face was pale in the moonlight. No, I agreed. Not a bear. I've seen bears in the wild before. Black bears, even a grizzly once on a trip to Montana. This wasn't a bear. The way it moved was all wrong. Too fluid, too upright. Bears don't stand like that, don't walk like that. And it was too tall, too broad. Even the biggest grizzly doesn't stand 8 feet tall with shoulders that wide. It wasn't a person either. No human is built like that. And what would a person be doing, crouched in the middle of a remote gravel road at 11 at night? We ended up taking the long way around, following the shoreline of the fishing spot until we hit another trail that eventually connected back to the main road about a mile past where our cars were parked. It took us an extra hour, stumbling through underbrush, but neither of us was willing to go back down that road. When we finally reached our cars, we sat inside mine with the doors locked and the engine running for about 20 minutes, neither of us wanting to be the first to leave. We tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was just a weird shadow. Maybe our eyes were playing tricks on us. But we both knew what we'd seen was real. Eventually, Jake followed me to the main highway before we split off toward our respective homes. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing standing there, turning to face us. I kept imagining what would have happened if it had decided to come toward us instead of walking away. Over the next few days, I searched online for any reports of strange sightings in Perry County. I found a few old forum posts about unusual tracks found in that area, and one person claiming they'd heard weird howls at night, but nothing specific like what we'd seen. I thought about reporting it to local authorities, but couldn't bring myself to do it. What would I say? That I saw a giant furry thing in the moonlight? They'd think I was drunk or high. Jake and I have talked about it a few times since then, but even between ourselves, we struggle to find the words to describe what we saw. We've both agreed on one thing, though. We're never walking that road at night again. In fact, I haven't been back to our fishing spot at all. Jake went once, in broad daylight with 3 other friends, but said he couldn't enjoy it. Kept looking over his shoulder the whole time. I've tried to convince myself it was just a strange, natural phenomenon. A trick of light and shadow, but deep down I know better. What we saw was alive, it was aware, it saw us as clearly as we saw it, and it made a choice to walk away. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't just the memory of what I saw, it's knowing that whatever it was, it's still out there, and wondering if next time it might not choose to walk away. I find myself thinking about those moments a lot, how it rose up, how it turned to face us, how it moved with such eerie calmness. There was an intelligence there that I can't explain. Not animal, not quite human either. Something else. Sometimes I wonder if it was watching us long before we noticed it. If it had been tracking us from the trees as we fished, waiting for darkness to fall. This thought makes my skin crawl even now, months later. I've started carrying bear spray whenever I'm outdoors, even in places where there shouldn't be any bears. I know it probably wouldn't do much good against whatever that was, but it makes me feel a little better. The worst part is the not knowing. Not knowing what it was, not knowing why it was there, not knowing if I'll ever encounter it again. I find myself scanning the tree line whenever I'm driving country roads now, especially at dusk. My girlfriend thinks I'm being paranoid. She says it was probably just a bear, despite my insistence otherwise. She wasn't there. She didn't see how it moved, how it stood, how it looked directly at us with what felt like purpose. I don't know what to call what Jake and I saw that night. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some kind of undiscovered species, or something else entirely. I don't have answers, just the memory of those moments on that gravel road, the silence, the stillness, and the sight of that massive shape disappearing into the trees. I'm writing this partly to see if anyone else has had a similar experience in that area. I've heard Perry County has a history of strange sightings, though most people don't talk about it much. Maybe someone reading this knows something I don't. Maybe there's an explanation that would help me sleep better at night. All I know is that the world feels different to me now. Bigger, stranger, more mysterious, and definitely more dangerous after dark. Story 8. I've always considered myself a pretty rational person. I grew up in the country, so unlike some of my city friends, I know what normal woodland sounds are. I know what coyotes sound like, what owls and foxes sound like, and I don't spook easily. But what's been happening on my property these past 2 years has completely shaken my confidence in what I thought I knew about the natural world. I bought this place about 3 years ago, 28 acres with a small farmhouse, an old barn, and some horse fields, all surrounded by dense forest. The previous owners were an elderly couple who'd lived here for decades. When I asked them why they were selling, they just said they were too old to keep up with the place anymore. But sometimes I wonder if there was more to it. The first incident happened during a bonfire I had in October, just after I'd settled in. I'd invited some friends over to celebrate my new place, and we were having a great time. Drinks, music, the whole thing. It was getting late, probably around 11 at night, when my friend Katie and I walked away from the group to grab more drinks from the house. We were about halfway across the horse field when Katie grabbed my arm so hard it left a bruise. "Olivia," she whispered, "what the hell is that?" At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed it, a tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the tree line about 200 yards away. Even from that distance, I could tell it was huge, way taller than any person I know. The strangest part was its head. It had this uneven, spiked hair silhouetted against the moonlight. It was just watching us. We stood frozen for maybe 5 seconds before it moved, and I don't mean it walked away. This thing covered about 50 feet in what seemed like 2 strides, then vanished into the trees. The speed was impossible. No human moves like that. When we rejoined the group, clearly shaken, 3 other friends admitted they'd seen something similar earlier. but hadn't said anything because they thought they were just drunk or seeing things. We ended the party pretty quickly after that. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a deer standing weirdly or shadows playing tricks in the firelight. But deep down, I knew better. That winter, the sounds started. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't heard them. They're almost right, but wrong, in a way that makes your skin crawl, like someone trying to imitate animal sounds without ever having actually heard them. The first time it happened, I was lying in bed reading around 1 in the morning. It started with what sounded like an owl hooting, but the cadence was off, too rhythmic, almost mechanical. Then came something like a dog bark, but stretched out and warped. Then a cat's meow that went on for way too long. The worst was this weird chattering, almost like a monkey, which is ridiculous because there are definitely no monkeys in these woods. These sounds would move around the property, sometimes seeming to come from right outside my window, sometimes from the far edge of the woods. They'd respond to each other like they were having a conversation. I started calling them the Peanut Gallery because it was less scary to think of them as some kind of joke rather than what they actually felt like, something intelligent testing my reactions. I've lived in rural areas all my life, and I've never heard anything like it. It doesn't happen every night, but it's frequent enough, especially in fall and winter, that I've come to expect it. Spring and summer are quieter, which makes me think whatever it is might migrate or move to different territories seasonally. My animals notice the change immediately. I have horses, chickens, 2 dogs, and 4 cats, about 30 animals in total. They're all country animals, used to being outdoors and dealing with the occasional coyote or fox. But last winter, their behavior completely changed. My oldest horse, Buddy, who's never been afraid of anything, now refuses to go near the back fence line after about 4 in the afternoon. The chickens, who normally free range all over the property, now huddle close to the house as soon as the light starts to fade. My dogs, who are both large breeds and usually fearless, will not go outside after dark without me right beside them. Even then, they stick close to the house, doing their business quickly before scratching frantically at the door to be let back in. The cats are the worst. They sit in the windows at night, staring into the darkness, their tails puffed up, occasionally making this low growling sound I'd never heard from them before. Sometimes they all focus on the same spot in the darkness, even when I can't see anything there. The feeling of being watched is constant now, especially in winter. I can be doing the most mundane things, collecting eggs, filling water troughs, walking down to check the mail, and suddenly I'll feel this presence. It's like the air gets heavier, and I can physically feel eyes on me. I've caught myself constantly scanning the tree line, looking for movement, for any sign of whatever's out there. The most intense experience happened just a couple weeks ago. It was early evening, not even fully dark yet, and I was walking back from the barn. The wind had been blowing pretty hard all day, but it suddenly shifted, and that's when I smelled it, this powerful sour odor. It was earthy and rotten at the same time, like wet fur mixed with decay. It was so strong it made my eyes water. At the exact same moment, I realized the forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just this oppressive, watching silence and that awful smell. I ran back to the house, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. Something primal in me knew I was being hunted, or at least assessed. The smell followed me for a few seconds, then disappeared as quickly as it had come. That night, the sounds were the worst they'd ever been, almost frantic, moving rapidly around the property, sometimes seeming to come from just outside my bedroom window. I didn't sleep at all. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out what could be living in these woods. My property backs up to a power line clearing that runs for miles, creating a sort of protected corridor where hunting isn't allowed. Those clearings are overgrown with blackberry bushes that produce tons of fruit in the summer. With my farm animals and their feed, plus the compost pile, there's plenty of food sources year-round. I've considered all the rational explanations. Bears don't move that fast or make those sounds. Mountain lions are solitary and don't stand upright like what we saw. Some kind of cult or squatters living in the woods. Maybe. But that doesn't explain the impossible speed or the animal behavior. Last month, I finally worked up the courage to set up some trail cameras around the property. I put them in places where I've most often felt that watching presence, along the back fence line, near the power line clearing, at the edge of the woods behind the house. 3 days later, I went to check them. Every single camera had been turned around to face the trees. Not knocked down or broken, deliberately turned, the mounting straps still perfectly intact. Whatever did it was careful enough not to damage the cameras, but wanted me to know it had found them. I've thought about selling the place, but who would I sell it to? Some family with kids. I couldn't live with myself if something happened to them. And honestly, part of me is too curious now. Whatever's out there hasn't tried to hurt me. It just seems to be observing, learning, testing boundaries. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I stand at my bedroom window and look out at the dark line of trees. I'll catch movement sometimes, just shadows shifting in ways that don't match the wind. Once I swear I saw those same uneven spiked silhouettes moving between the trunks, tall and deliberate. The worst part is that I've started feeling like it's getting bolder. Last week, I found footprints in the mud near the horse trough. Huge, bare, human-like feet, but with all the wrong proportions. The toes were too long, the arch too pronounced. I took photos, but when I came back an hour later to measure them, they were gone, smoothed over like someone had carefully erased them. 2 nights ago, I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of my front porch steps creaking. The dogs were whining, pressed against my bedroom door, but they wouldn't bark. I lay there in the dark, barely breathing, as something heavy moved across my porch, pausing at the windows, at the door. I heard deep, rumbling breathing, in and out, like something huge just on the other side of the wall. I didn't look. I couldn't. I just lay there, paralyzed, as whatever it was moved around the perimeter of my house, testing, listening. After what felt like hours, the steps creaked again, and then silence returned. In the morning, I found mud on the porch and long, coarse, dark hairs caught in the splintered wood of the railing. I put them in a plastic bag, but I haven't shown them to anyone. What would I even say? The thing is, I don't feel threatened exactly. If whatever's out there wanted to hurt me, it's had plenty of chances. It feels more like I'm being studied, like my property has become some kind of observation post for something that's just as curious about me as I am about it. But that doesn't make me feel any safer, because whatever's watching me from the woods isn't human, and it's getting closer every day. I'm writing this now because last night, for the first time, I heard it speak. I was half asleep when the familiar sounds started, the almost owl hoots, the not quite dog barks. But then, clear as day, in a voice that sounded like rocks grinding together, I heard my name, Olivia. 3 distinct syllables, drawn out and halting, like it was practicing. I haven't left the house today. The animals are all inside with me. It's starting to get dark, and I can feel it out there, waiting. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what to do. All I know is that something intelligent is living in these woods during the winter months, and it knows who I am. And I think tonight, it's finally ready to introduce itself. Story 9. I still don't know how to explain what I saw that day in October of '94. It's been almost 30 years, and I've never really told the full story to anyone outside my family. My dad took most of it to his grave, and I've spent countless nights wondering if I should just let it die with me too. I was 17 then, living with my dad outside Rolla, Missouri. My mom had left when I was 12, and it had been just me and Dad ever since. Every year when deer season approached, Dad would get this excited gleam in his eye. He wasn't just a hunter. He was methodical about it. He'd spend weeks before the season officially opened just scouting locations, tracking deer movements, and setting up blinds. That late October day was miserable weather-wise. A cold front had moved in overnight, bringing this steady, cold drizzle that soaked into everything. The temperature was probably in the mid-40s, but the dampness made it feel much colder. I remember I had on this old green army surplus jacket that wasn't really waterproof anymore, and my jeans were already damp at the bottoms from just walking to the truck. Dad had insisted we go out, despite the weather. "Best time to scout," he'd said over breakfast. "Nobody else will be out there, and the deer move different in the rain." I didn't argue. I never did when it came to hunting stuff. Dad knew what he was doing, and besides, I liked our trips together, even in crappy weather. We took his old Ford F-150, dark blue with rust spots forming around the wheel wells. The truck had this particular smell I can still remember. Gun oil, leather, and this faint musty odor from the heater that only kicked in when it was really cold. Dad had mounted a special bracket on his driver's side mirror where he could rest his Remington 270 rifle on a small sandbag rig. He'd had a gunsmith mount this really nice loopholed scope on it the year before. Not that he'd ever shoot from the truck, but it let him scout and spot deer from the cab without getting soaked. The roads were absolute garbage that day. We were on these back clay roads that turn into a slick mess when wet. There's a particular kind of mud in Missouri that's like driving on grease when it rains. The truck would fishtail even at 5 miles per hour. I remember gripping the door handle as Dad carefully navigated the ruts and puddles, the wipers making this rhythmic squeak every few seconds that was driving me nuts. We'd been out for maybe 2 hours, crawling along at barely walking pace. When we came to this 4-way intersection deep in the woods, I'm talking middle of nowhere, no signs, just 4 muddy tracks meeting in a small clearing with dense oak and hickory woods all around. The rain had picked up a bit, making that patter sound on the roof of the truck that's normally comforting but felt isolating out there. Dad suddenly went still. I was messing with the radio, trying to find something besides static, when I noticed his hand reach for the rifle. He didn't say anything, just moved very deliberately, picking up the rifle and looking through the scope down the road to our right. I followed his gaze but couldn't see anything through the rain-streaked passenger window. After maybe 30 seconds, he slowly handed the rifle to me, still not saying a word. His face had this expression I'd never seen before. Not exactly fear, but a kind of intense focus mixed with disbelief. When I took the rifle, my hands were shaking a little. I had no idea what he'd spotted, but his reaction had me on edge. I leaned over and positioned the rifle on the sandbag, looking through the scope down the right-hand road. At first, all I saw was the muddy track disappearing into the trees about 100 yards away, where the woods opened up a bit above a roadside ditch. Then I saw it. My first thought was bear, which made no sense because we didn't have many black bears in Missouri then, and seeing one would have been remarkable on its own. But what I was looking at was much more unsettling. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders covered in dark, matted fur that looked wet in patches from the rain. It was standing at the edge of the woods, partially obscured by the mist and rain, but clearly visible through the scope. As I watched, the creature reached up, and this is what made my blood run cold. It reached up to pull leaves from a low-hanging oak branch. No bear could reach that high while standing. Its arm extended at least 3 feet above its head, and I could see its hand or paw, I don't know what to call it, stripping leaves from the branch. It would pull a handful, bring them to its mouth, chew, and then reach for more. The movement was so casual, so deliberate. Not animal-like, but not quite human either. "Dad," I whispered, not taking my eye from the scope. "What the hell is that?" He just shook his head. I could feel the truck idling beneath us, the engine's vibration mixing with my own trembling. Then something else happened that I've replayed in my mind thousands of times since. From the brush behind the large creature, two smaller figures bounded up. They were covered in the same dark fur, but were only about waist-high to the adult, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall. They moved differently, almost playfully, darting through puddles in the road like children playing tag. One splashed through a puddle, sending muddy water toward the other, who dodged and then did the same thing back. They ran behind the larger creature and then back out to the road again, never straying far. The whole scene was surreal. This massive creature calmly eating leaves, while what I can only describe as its children played in the rain nearby. They never looked our way, never seemed to notice our truck sitting there at the intersection about 100 yards away. The engine was barely audible over the rain, and we were downwind from them. We sat there frozen for what must have been 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. The rain tapped steadily on the roof, creating this weird soundtrack to the incredible scene I was witnessing. The large creature never turned to face us directly. It just continued methodically stripping and eating leaves, occasionally ducking as branches snapped back. I remember thinking how careful it seemed not to break the branches, just bending them down to reach the leaves. Dad never aimed the rifle at them, never even suggested it. He knew, and I knew, these weren't creatures to provoke. Looking back, I'm grateful for his restraint. Some other hunters might have reacted differently. Eventually, the rain picked up, becoming heavy enough that it obscured my view through the scope. I wiped the lens with my sleeve, and when I looked back, the road was empty. All 3 creatures had vanished into the trees without a sound, at least none that we could hear over the downpour. We sat there for another few minutes, neither of us speaking. Finally, Dad put the truck in gear and turned around, heading back the way we'd come. We didn't talk about what we'd seen until we were almost home, and even then, the conversation was brief. "Those weren't bears," I said, stating the obvious. Dad just nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. "No, they weren't." "So what were they?" He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Some things in these woods don't have names, Ethan. Some things are better left alone." That was pretty much it. We didn't discuss it again that day. But a week later, after the rain had cleared and the roads had dried somewhat, Dad suggested we go back. I was surprised. I'd half convinced myself we'd both somehow imagined the whole thing. We drove to the same intersection, parked the truck, and walked down the right-hand road to where we'd seen the creatures. The oak tree with its overhanging branch was easy to spot. Dad had brought a measuring tape, and we found the area where the leaves had been stripped. The branch height was over 11 feet from the ground. 11 feet. No man could reach that high without a ladder, and certainly no bear. We looked for tracks but found none. The ground had dried too much, and the clay had hardened. But there were other signs, scratches on tree bark, broken twigs where the creatures had crossed the ditch, and a distinct path leading into the deeper woods that didn't look like a deer trail. Dad told only one person about what we'd seen, his hunting buddy Frank. Frank dismissed it as a bear with cubs, said the rain and poor visibility had played tricks on our eyes. Dad never argued the point. He knew what we'd seen, and so did I. He hunted those woods for another 20 years until his heart gave out in 2014. He never saw those creatures again. At least, he never told me if he did. But there were nights, especially rainy ones, when I'd find him sitting at the kitchen table late at night, staring at the back door, as if expecting to see that dark shape appear. I still live in Missouri, not far from Rolla. I occasionally drive that back road in daylight, never at dusk or in the rain. Every time I pass that oak tree with its overhanging branch, I remember. Sometimes I stop the car, get out, and just listen to the woods. I've never seen anything like what we saw that day, but sometimes, when the wind is right and the forest is quiet, I get this feeling I'm being watched. I don't know what we saw that rainy October day in '94, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown species. The label doesn't matter. What matters is that for a brief moment, my dad and I glimpsed something extraordinary, something that existed outside our understanding of the world. And despite all the years that have passed, despite all the rational explanations I've tried to apply, I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night when the rain taps against my window, I find myself staring at my back door, just like Dad used to do. Story 10. I still don't sleep right since that weekend at Two Lakes. It's been nearly 9 years now, but I can still hear that roar when I close my eyes at night. I've never shared this online before. Only family and a few close friends know what happened. Most think we're crazy or we're drunk, but Darren and I know what we saw. It was early October 2014, and Darren and I had been planning one last fishing trip before winter hit Alberta hard. We'd been going to Two Lakes Provincial Park near Grand Prairie for years. It's this beautiful, quiet spot with two small lakes nestled between rolling hills and dense forest. Perfect for catching pike and just disconnecting from the world. We drove up on a Friday afternoon, my old F-150 packed with our gear, tent, sleeping bags, cooler full of beer and bait, fishing rods, and enough food for the weekend. What struck us immediately was how empty the place was. Usually there'd be at least a few other campers or day fishermen, but the ranger station was closed for the season, and we didn't see another vehicle anywhere, just us and the wilderness. "Looks like we've got the whole place to ourselves," Darren said, grinning as we pulled into the small gravel lot. I remember feeling this weird mix of excitement and unease. I've always loved solitude in nature, but something felt different this time. We hiked about half a mile to our favorite spot, a small clearing on a slight rise above the smaller of the two lakes. Perfect view, protected from the wind, and close enough to the water to hear the gentle lapping against the shore. We set up our dome tent, gathered firewood, and got our camp in order before heading down to try our luck fishing before sunset. The fishing was decent that afternoon. I caught 2 small pike, and Darren landed a nice-sized one we decided to keep for dinner. We cleaned it right there by the shore, tossing the guts into the water as we always did. Looking back, I wonder if that was what initially attracted it. As darkness fell, we got a good fire going, cooked the pike with some potatoes and cracked open a couple beers. It was a clear night, temperature dropping fast the way it does in Alberta in October. The stars were incredible. No light pollution out there, just an endless canopy of stars. We were shooting the shit, talking about work, Darren's new girlfriend, all the usual stuff. That's when we heard the first splash. It wasn't like a fish jumping. I've heard thousands of those over the years. This was heavy, like someone had thrown a boulder into the lake. We both stopped mid-conversation and looked toward the water. "What the hell was that?" I asked. "Probably a beaver," Darren suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. Then it happened again, splash, even louder this time, and then a third one. We grabbed our flashlights and walked down to the shore. The beam of light played across the black water, but there was nothing there. No ripples, no movement, nothing. Whatever had made those splashes was gone or hiding. "Maybe a moose," I suggested, but we both knew moose don't usually hang out in lakes after dark. We stood there for maybe 5 minutes, scanning the lake and shoreline before giving up and heading back to the fire. That's when we heard it. 3 distinct, loud knocks coming from the forest behind our campsite, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. Knock, 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 deliberate, spaced out perfectly. "Just branches breaking in the wind," Darren said. But there wasn't any wind. We stayed up a bit longer, but the weird sounds had killed the vibe. Around 11, we doused the fire and crawled into the tent. I remember having trouble falling asleep, just lying there listening to the normal sounds of the forest at night, which suddenly didn't seem so normal anymore. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I knew, Darren was nudging me awake. The luminous dial on my watch read just after 2 in the morning. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. And then I heard it. Footsteps, heavy footsteps circling our tent, slow, deliberate steps that made the ground vibrate slightly. Whatever it was big, much bigger than a person. We lay there frozen, barely breathing, as the steps made a complete circle around our tent. Then they stopped, right at the entrance. That's when something pressed against the side of the tent. Not a poke or a prod, but like something was leaning its weight against it. The nylon wall of the tent flexed inward, then back out like something was testing it. "Hey!" Darren suddenly yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "Get out of here!" That was when it slapped the tent. Not a gentle tap, but a hard whack that shook the entire structure and knocked over our backpacks that were leaning in the corner. The sound that followed still haunts me. A deep, raspy breathing and a low, rumbling growl that I felt more than heard. It was like nothing I've ever heard from any animal, not a bear, not a cougar, nothing. Then it moved to the top of the tent. Our dome tent was about 5 feet tall at its center, and whatever this thing was, it reached right over the top. I could see the outline of what looked like a hand, a massive hand, pressing down, making the roof of the tent sag alarmingly. 5 fingers, but huge. The whole tent seemed to groan under the weight. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the pressure released. The footsteps moved away, back toward the forest edge. We lay there, paralyzed with fear, clutching our flashlights and the small hunting knife I always carried. I remember my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. "What the fuck was that?" Darren whispered, his voice barely audible. Before I could answer, we heard a massive crack from the direction of the forest, the unmistakable sound of a tree trunk snapping completely. Not a branch breaking, but a whole tree, and then came the roar. Jesus Christ, that roar. It started as a low rumble and built into this earth-shaking bellow that echoed across the lake. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a moose. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard in 20-plus years of hunting and fishing in the Canadian wilderness. "We need to get to the truck," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm despite the terror coursing through me. We unzipped the tent as quietly as possible and stepped out into the cold night air. That's when we saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing, partially illuminated by the moonlight, was something I still struggled to describe. It was massive, nearly 8 feet tall, with shoulders twice as wide as a large man's. Its arms hung unnaturally long, almost to its knees. It was covered in what looked like dark fur or hair, matted in places. But it was the stance that got me. Perfectly upright, on 2 legs, watching us with a terrifying intelligence. Darren raised his flashlight, and the beam caught its eyes. They reflected back a deep, glowing red. Then it opened its mouth, revealing enormous yellowish teeth, and let out another roar that physically hurt my ears. It reached up, grabbed the top of a young tree beside it, and just tore it off, like it was snapping a twig. The display of strength was so casual, so effortless, it felt like a warning. "Run!" I screamed, and we both bolted toward the trail that led back to the parking lot. We didn't even grab our stuff, just our car keys, and ran for our lives. Behind us, we could hear it moving through the brush alongside the trail, not directly following, but paralleling us. It was smashing through branches and undergrowth, making these barking, grunting sounds as it went. It could have caught us easily if it wanted to. We were stumbling in the dark while it moved through the forest with terrifying speed and confidence. Somehow we made it to the truck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As we peeled out of that gravel lot, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror of something large moving at the forest edge. We drove straight through to the nearest town, about 20 miles away, and sat in an all-night diner parking lot until sunrise, neither of us saying much. We were in shock. When daylight came, against all better judgment, we decided to go back for our gear. Safety in daylight, we figured, plus we had several $100s worth of camping equipment back there. The campsite was destroyed. Our tent was in shreds, like something had methodically torn it apart. The cooler was smashed, contents strewn everywhere. But the most chilling thing was the footprints, huge, human-like impressions in the soft earth around our camp. I put my boot next to one for scale. My size 11 was dwarfed by it, and the stride length between prints was impossible for any human to make. We grabbed what we could salvage and got the hell out of there. Didn't even report it to the rangers. What would we say? That a Sasquatch trashed our camp? We'd sound insane. When I told my brother later, he laughed and said we'd encountered a grizzly. But grizzlies don't stand 8 feet tall on 2 legs. They don't have hands with 5 fingers. They don't parallel your escape route while making barking sounds. And they sure as hell don't deliberately knock on trees to communicate. Darren and I don't talk about it much anymore. He moved to Ontario the following year, said he needed to live somewhere with fewer trees. I still fish, but never alone, and never at 2 lakes. I know what we saw that night. I know what stalked us and destroyed our camp. Call it Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or whatever you want. It exists, and it lives in those woods near 2 Lakes Provincial Park. I've become obsessed with researching similar encounters since then. Turns out, Northern Alberta has a long history of sightings, especially among the indigenous communities. Some of their descriptions match exactly what we experienced. I've never gone back to 2 Lakes, and I never will. Some places, once you learn what really lives there, are better left alone. Story 11. I've never considered myself the type of person who believes in the paranormal or cryptids or any of that stuff. I used to laugh at those shows where they go looking for Bigfoot with night vision cameras. I mean, how could something that big remain hidden in today's world with everyone carrying cameras? That was before October 26, 2018. Now, I'm not so quick to dismiss what other people claim they've seen. I work at a manufacturing plant in Glenwood, Iowa, and I live in Atlantic. It's about a 40-minute commute each way, mostly on these narrow country back roads that wind through farmland. I've been making this drive for almost 7 years now, so I know every curve, every pothole, every spot where deer are likely to jump out. I usually work the early shift that starts at 6 a.m., which means I leave my house around 4:40 in the morning. In late October, it's still pitch black at that hour. That morning started like any other. I woke up at 4, showered, grabbed my travel mug of coffee, and headed out to my Honda Civic. It was cold in the low 30s, and I remember there being this light fog in some of the low-lying areas. Nothing too bad, just patches here and there. I was about 20 minutes into my drive, on one of those stretches where you don't see another car for miles. I was approaching this particular curve I know well. It's a gentle bend to the right that straightens out into a long stretch with fields on both sides. There's a wire fence that runs along the left side of the road, separating the pavement from a cornfield that had already been harvested for the season. I had the radio on low, some morning talk show I wasn't really paying attention to. As I started taking the curve, my headlights swept across the left shoulder of the road, and I saw something that made me immediately ease off the gas. At first, I thought it was a person walking along the edge of the road, which would have been weird enough at that hour in the middle of nowhere. My first thought was maybe someone's car had broken down, though I hadn't passed any vehicles. As I got closer, I realized whatever was walking along that shoulder was way too big to be a normal person. I'm not talking a little taller than average. I mean, this thing was massive. I slowed down even more, probably to about 15 miles per hour. The thing that stands out most in my mind is how my headlights hit it from behind, creating this silhouette that just seemed to keep going up and up. The creature, and I don't know what else to call it, was walking with its back to me, moving in the same direction I was driving. It never turned around or acknowledged my car in any way. As I got closer, I could see it was covered completely in hair. Not like a coat or a costume. This was hair that grew naturally out of its body. Dark hair, maybe dark brown or black. It was hard to tell in the headlights. The hair wasn't uniform either. It was thicker around the shoulders and upper arms, almost like a mane. The height is what I can't get over. My Honda Civic isn't a tall car, and this thing's hands, its actual hands, were level with the bottom of my passenger window as I drove past. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging down almost to its knees, and they swung naturally as it walked. Not like someone in a costume trying to mimic an ape walk. This was smooth, natural movement. I remember gripping my steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I wasn't breathing. Time seemed to slow down as I drove past it, probably only a few feet away. I couldn't take my eyes off it, but I also didn't want to stop or do anything to draw attention to myself. It never looked my way, just kept walking with these long, purposeful strides. As I passed it, and it was now behind me, I glanced in my rearview mirror. That's when I saw it casually step off the road and, without breaking stride, step right over a 4-foot wire fence like it was nothing. Just lifted one leg over, then the other, and continued walking into the harvested field. There was no awkwardness to the movement, no hesitation. It was like watching someone step over a small puddle. I didn't realize I had been holding my breath until my lungs started burning. I sucked in air and pressed the gas pedal, wanting to put distance between me and whatever that was, but I couldn't stop looking in my mirrors. The creature just kept walking across the field, getting smaller in the distance until I couldn't see it anymore in the darkness. What stands out to me, even now, is how casual the whole thing was. It wasn't startled by my car. It didn't run or hide. It was just walking, using the road like a path of convenience, probably because at 4:40 in the morning there's almost no traffic out there. It seemed so at ease, so comfortable in its surroundings. That's what makes me think it wasn't its first time in that area. When I got to work, I was shaking. I sat in my car in the parking lot for maybe 10 minutes, trying to process what I'd just seen. I thought about telling my co-workers, but I knew how it would sound. I've always been the practical one, the guy who makes fun of conspiracy theories and ghost stories. If I started talking about seeing Bigfoot on my way to work, I'd never hear the end of it. So I kept it to myself for a while. I started researching online, looking up Bigfoot sightings in Iowa. Turns out there have been quite a few reports in the western part of the state over the years. Some of them described encounters similar to mine, brief sightings along rural roads in the early morning or late evening. I've tried to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was someone in a costume, but who would be walking along a deserted country road before 5 a.m. in a perfect Bigfoot costume? And the way it moved, there was nothing artificial about it. The height doesn't make sense either. Based on where its hands were relative to my car window, it must have been 7.5 to 8 feet tall. No costume could account for that kind of height and still allow for such natural movement. Could it have been a bear walking upright? Definitely not. We don't have bears in this part of Iowa, and even if we did, what I saw had a completely human-like gait. It wasn't an animal on its hind legs. It was a bipedal creature that walks upright as its natural way of moving. For weeks after, I took a different route to work. It added about 15 minutes to my commute, but I didn't care. Eventually, though, I went back to my regular route, partly because the longer drive was getting old, and partly because, as scared as I was, I also had this weird hope of seeing it again, maybe getting a better look or even a photo if I could get my phone out in time. I've driven that same route hundreds of times since then, and I've never seen it again. But every time I approach that curve, I slow down. Every time, my heart beats a little faster. I keep my phone in the cup holder now, camera app ready to go, and I always check my mirrors after I pass that spot, watching the fence line and the field beyond. The encounter changed me. I used to think people who claimed to see these things were attention seekers or were misidentifying known animals. Now I understand why someone would keep an experience like this to themselves. Who wants to be labeled crazy or have their credibility questioned? I haven't told many people about what happened. Only my wife knows the full story, and a couple close friends who I trust not to judge. I don't know what to call what I saw that morning. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever. The name doesn't really matter. What matters is that there was a creature on that road that shouldn't exist according to science, but I saw it with my own eyes. It was real, solid, and going about its business like it belonged there. Sometimes I wonder if it lives in the area. There are some heavily wooded areas along the Nishnabotna River not far from that road. Plenty of places where something could stay hidden if it knew the terrain and avoided people. Maybe it was just passing through. Maybe there are more of them. I've thought about reporting it to one of those Bigfoot research organizations, but part of me wants to keep this experience private. If word got out, people might start combing those fields and woods looking for it. Trail cameras would go up. The creature seemed so peaceful, just walking along, minding its own business. I'd hate to be responsible for disturbing that. The thing that gets me the most, even now, is the casualness of the encounter. It wasn't some dramatic event with roaring and chest beating like in the movies. It was just a quiet moment on a dark road where two completely different worlds briefly crossed paths. It didn't seem threatened by me, and honestly, it didn't seem interested in me at all. I was just another car on the road, and it had somewhere to be. I've become more open-minded about a lot of things since that morning. When people talk about seeing strange things, I don't dismiss them anymore. There's a lot we don't know about the world around us, even the parts we think we've fully explored. I still take that same route to work every day, and every time I approach that curve, I slow down a little, turn down the radio, and look carefully at the shoulder of the road. I keep checking my mirrors long after I've passed the spot, just in case. I don't have proof. No photos, no hair samples, no footprints. Just my memory of those few seconds when my headlights illuminated something impossible. But it was real. It was there. And somewhere out in those fields and woods between Atlantic and Glenwood, it might still be there, going about its life while we go about ours, separated by just a thin veil of trees and darkness and disbelief. Story 12. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened to me back in mid-November of 2015. I've been deer hunting my whole life, but this was something else entirely. I've told a few close friends and family members, but most people just laugh it off. I'm hoping someone here might have experienced something similar. I was hunting on my family's property near Travelers Rest, South Carolina. It's about 30 acres of mostly woodland that's been in our family for generations. I've hunted there since I was a kid with my dad, so I know every inch of that land. That morning started like any other hunting day. I woke up at 3:30, made coffee, grabbed the donuts I'd bought the night before, hunting day tradition, and loaded up my gear on the four-wheeler. It had rained pretty heavily the day before, and the ground was still soft and muddy. I remember the tires of my four-wheeler kept sinking into the mud as I made my way to my usual spot. I always set up my blind in the same place, at the edge of a small clearing by this old fence line that separates our property from the state forest beyond. It's a good spot because deer often follow that fence line when moving through the area. The fence itself is pretty substantial, double wide, with an electric line running along the top. You'd need a ladder to get over it without getting shocked or caught in the wire. I arrived well before daylight, probably around 4:45, and set up my pop-up blind. It's one of those fabric ones, about 6 feet tall at the peak. I got everything situated, my chair, rifle, binoculars, thermos of coffee, and those donuts I mentioned. Then I settled in to wait for first light. The woods were quiet that morning, unusually quiet now that I think about it. Normally you hear all sorts of early morning sounds, birds starting to chirp, small animals rustling in the underbrush. But that day, there was just nothing. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I just sipped my coffee and waited for the deer to show up. Around 6:15, just as the first hint of daylight was starting to filter through the trees, I heard something moving in the brush behind the fence. At first I thought, finally a deer, and I slowly set down my coffee. But as I listened more carefully, I realized whatever was moving was way too heavy to be a deer. The footsteps were deliberate and spaced far apart. Then I heard the most unnerving sound. It sounded like something effortlessly stepping over that fence. Now, that fence is about 5 feet tall with the electric wire making it closer to 6 feet. Whatever cleared it did so without any struggle or noise of climbing, just a soft whoosh as something big moved over it. After that came the footsteps. God, those footsteps. Each one made this deep thud in the wet ground that I could feel more than hear. It was like when you feel the bass from a car stereo before you actually hear the music. Each step sent a tiny vibration through the ground and up into my blind. The steps were slow and deliberate, heading straight toward my blind. I sat completely still, barely breathing. My rifle was across my lap, but I didn't dare move to aim it. Whatever was out there was moving with purpose, directly toward me. The footsteps stopped right beside my blind, literally right next to the thin fabric wall. I could hear breathing, deep, heavy breathing, not like a person who's been exerting themselves, but like something with massive lungs just naturally breathing. It sounded, I don't know how to describe it except to say it sounded wild, primal. The breathing was so close I swear I could feel the warm air pushing through the fabric of the blind. Then it got worse. Something leaned over the top of my blind. I watched in horror as the roof fabric bulged inward under the weight of whatever it was. I could see what looked like the tip of a wide, flat nose pressing against the fabric, sniffing along the top seam where the roof meets the walls. My blind is 6 feet at its highest point, and I'm 6'1". Whatever was leaning over my blind had to be at least 8 feet tall, probably taller. The sniffing continued, loud and deliberate like a dog tracking a scent, but much, much bigger. The roof kept flexing under the weight as whatever it was shifted position slightly. I had my rifle ready, but pointed at the floor. I wasn't about to fire unless I absolutely had to. For one thing, I had no idea what I was dealing with. For another, if it was what I think it was, a single rifle shot might just make it angry. I've never been so terrified in my life. I was shaking so badly I had to press my arms against my sides to keep steady. My mouth was completely dry, and I was scared to even swallow in case it hurt me. The whole time I kept thinking, this isn't real. This can't be happening. But it was. After what felt like forever, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes, the creature started to move again. It circled partway around my blind, and I could hear its footsteps sucking at the wet earth with each step. The sound was distinctive, not like boots or shoes on mud, but like bare feet, only massive. Each step made this wet suction sound as it lifted its foot from the mud. I tracked its movement by sound as it circled about halfway around my blind, then paused again, sniffing. Then, thankfully, it started moving away back toward the fence and the woods beyond. The footsteps gradually faded, but I didn't move a muscle for at least another hour. I was too scared to even look out the small window of my blind. When I finally gathered the courage to peek outside, the clearing was empty. The sun was up by then, probably around 7:30, and everything looked normal. But I knew what I'd heard. I knew something had been there. I waited another half hour before I finally stepped out of the blind. My legs were so shaky I almost fell over. The first thing I did was look at the ground where I'd heard the footsteps. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the mud. Not animal tracks, not human tracks, but something in between. They were wide, deep impressions with 5 distinct toes that resembled an oversized human foot. Each print was at least 16 inches long and must have been 8 inches wide. The stride length between prints was enormous, easily 4 feet apart. No human I know could make steps that far apart, especially not in deep mud. I followed the tracks to the fence line. The top wire of the electric fence was bent slightly downward, as if something large had stepped over it. Not climbed over it, stepped over a 6-foot fence. The tracks continued on the other side, heading deeper into the state forest. I didn't hunt that day. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and got the hell out of there. On the ride back to the house, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched from the tree line. I've thought about that day almost every day since it happened. I've researched similar encounters online, looked at pictures of footprints, read about behaviors. Everything I experienced matches descriptions of Bigfoot encounters. I know how that sounds. Before this happened, I would have laughed at anyone who claimed they saw a Bigfoot. But after what I experienced, I don't laugh anymore. I still hunt on our property. I'm not going to let fear keep me from doing what I love. But I've made some changes. I don't use that ground blind anymore. Instead, I built a tree stand about 15 feet up an oak tree. I figure whatever I encountered that day probably can't climb trees that easily. I always carry my rifle loaded now, and I've added a powerful flashlight to my gear, and I never ever take my eyes off that fence line. The strangest part is that I never actually saw it. I just heard it, felt it, and found its tracks. Sometimes I think that makes it worse. My mind fills in the blanks with something more terrifying than what might have actually been there. But then I remember those footprints, that bent fence wire, and the way my blind's roof caved in under its weight. And I know whatever it was real. I've been back to that spot many times since, hoping to find more evidence or maybe even see it from a distance. But there's been nothing. No more tracks, no more encounters. Sometimes I wonder if it was just passing through, or if it still watches me from the trees when I hunt. The thing that gets me the most is the intelligence it seemed to display. It knew I was in that blind. It deliberately approached, investigated, and then left without harming me. It wasn't just some animal following instinct. It was curious, cautious, and aware. That's what truly keeps me up at night. I haven't told many people this story. Those I have told either think I'm making it up or suggest it was a bear. But I know what bear tracks look like, and I know bears don't walk on two legs for extended periods. Bears don't step over 6-foot fences without disturbing them, and bears don't make 16-inch footprints with 5 human-like toes. I don't know what else to say except that it happened, exactly as I've described it. I'm not claiming I saw Bigfoot, but I encountered something in those woods that I can't explain. Something that shouldn't exist according to science, but was definitely there that morning in Traveler's Rest. And sometimes, when I'm sitting in my tree stand and the woods get unusually quiet, I get the feeling it's still out there, watching and waiting. Story 13. I've never been sure if I should share this, but it's been almost 40 years, and I still think about it all the time. Back in September of 1984, my friend Linda and I decided to go hiking in the Sierra Nevada mountains above Lake Tahoe. We were both 25 at the time, and pretty experienced hikers. We'd grown up exploring those mountains, so we weren't exactly newbies. That morning started like any other hiking day. We packed our day packs with water, some sandwiches, trail mix, and basic first aid stuff. The plan was to hike up to this old deer hunter's cabin that was about halfway up the mountain. It wasn't on any official maps, but locals knew about it. The trail was challenging. Lots of steep sections and loose rocks, but nothing we couldn't handle. We got to the trailhead around 9 in the morning. It was one of those perfect September days. Not too hot, not too cold, clear blue sky. As we were checking our laces one last time before heading out, these 2 teenage boys came tearing down the trail like something was chasing them. They were probably 16 or 17, and they were absolutely booking it. When they saw us, they slowed down just enough to catch their breath. The taller one, face all red and sweaty, said, "Don't go up there, ladies. There's a monster up there." His friend was nodding frantically beside him, still panting. Linda and I just looked at each other and rolled our eyes. We figured they'd either seen a black bear, which aren't uncommon in the area, or they were high on something. I asked them what they'd seen, and they just kept saying it was huge and hairy and walking on 2 legs. Then they took off toward the parking lot without another word. "Kids," Linda said, and we laughed it off. We'd both grown up with stories about Bigfoot and Sasquatch, but we'd never taken them seriously. They were just campfire tales to scare tourists. The hike up was uneventful. We stopped a few times to drink water and take in the view of the lake below. It was spectacular, with the water looking like polished blue glass from that height. After about 2 hours of hiking, we reached the old cabin. It wasn't much, just a simple 1-room structure with some basic furniture inside. No one had used it in years from the looks of it, but it was still standing. We ate our sandwiches on this little bluff near the cabin that offered an amazing panoramic view. We spent about an hour there, just relaxing and chatting about work and relationships and all the usual stuff. Linda had just broken up with her boyfriend, so she needed to vent. Around 1 in the afternoon, we decided to head back down. On our way, we veered off the main trail to check out this little creek that ran through a ravine. Linda collected interesting rocks, and I liked looking for pine cones for craft projects. The creek bed was littered with smooth, colorful stones and perfectly shaped pine cones. As I was bending down to pick up a particularly large cone, I noticed this smell. It's hard to describe exactly, but it was pungent and unpleasant, like animal droppings mixed with something rotting. Not dead animal rotting, but more like old garbage or compost that's gone bad. I mentioned it to Linda, and she smelled it too. Probably a dead deer or something, she said, wrinkling her nose. Let's keep moving. We continued along the creek, still picking up stones and pine cones. I had a handful of cones, and Linda's jacket pockets were bulging with rocks. The smell seemed to get stronger as we moved upstream. I was looking down at the ground, focused on finding more pine cones, when I realized Linda had stopped walking. I looked up at her, and she was standing completely still, staring up the hill, with this expression I'd never seen on her face before. It was pure shock, mixed with fear. I followed her gaze, and that's when I saw it. Standing across the creek, no more than 30 feet away, was something. I say something because my brain couldn't immediately process what I was seeing. It was standing on 2 legs like a person, but it was massive, at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It had a solid, broad build with wide shoulders and long arms that hung way past its waist. The whole thing was covered in hair, not fur exactly, but hair, reddish-brown like dried pine needles. The hair seemed a bit thinner around the chest and face. The face, I couldn't make out detailed features, but it wasn't like an ape or a bear. It had a flattened nose and deep-set eyes under a prominent brow ridge. Its head sat directly on its shoulders with almost no neck visible. I dropped all my pine cones. Linda and I just stood there, frozen. The creature was watching us too, not moving either. For what felt like forever but was probably just a few seconds, we all just stared at each other. Then, without any sign of alarm or hurry, it turned and walked up the steep slope behind it. The slope was covered in loose pine needles, the kind that make you slip and slide when you try to climb them. But this thing moved up it effortlessly. Its stride was long and fluid, arms swinging naturally at its sides. It didn't scramble or use its hands to climb. It just walked up like the steep incline was nothing. Linda grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. I couldn't even respond properly. I just nodded, my mouth completely dry. We both knew exactly what we'd seen, but neither of us wanted to say it out loud. It made no sense. It couldn't be real, yet we'd both seen it clear as day. "We need to go," I finally managed to say. "Now." We turned and started walking quickly back toward the main trail, constantly looking over our shoulders. That's when I noticed the creature was moving parallel to us, staying uphill, but heading in the same direction we were. It wasn't approaching us, just keeping pace, visible through the trees. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I wanted to run, but I was terrified that running might trigger it to chase us. So we kept up this brisk walk, occasionally glancing up to see if it was still there. And it always was. Keeping that same distance, moving with that same smooth gait. The walk back to the trailhead seemed to take forever. We didn't talk much, just occasional whispers of, "Is it still there?" followed by a terrified, "Yes." As we got closer to our truck, I kept hoping it would turn back into the deeper forest, but it didn't. When we finally reached the parking lot, we looked up one last time. The creature had climbed onto this huge granite boulder that overlooked the trailhead. It was crouched down, just watching us. From that distance, maybe a football field's length away, it looked like a dark silhouette against the sky, but unmistakably there. We jumped in the truck, and Linda's hands were shaking so badly she dropped the keys twice before managing to start the engine. We drove back to town in complete silence. I don't think either of us knew what to say. That night, we talked about what we'd seen. We debated whether to report it to someone, the Forest Service, the local sheriff, somebody, but we kept coming back to the same concern. What if they decided to hunt it down? The creature hadn't threatened us. It had just observed us and kept its distance. We didn't want to be responsible for anything happening to it, so we decided to keep quiet. We told our close friends, who mostly thought we were exaggerating or had seen a bear standing on its hind legs. But Linda and I knew what we'd seen. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk upright for extended periods with that kind of gait. They don't have that body structure, and they sure as hell don't track humans for over a mile while maintaining a careful distance. About 3 years later, after a big storm had knocked down some trees along that ridge above the trail, Linda and I hiked back up there. We were nervous, but also curious. We didn't see the creature again, but we did find something interesting. Near where we'd had our encounter, there was a natural shelter formed between a huge granite boulder and some fallen tree branches. The ground inside was packed down, like something had rested there repeatedly. There were no obvious footprints, but the pine needles inside were arranged in an almost nest-like formation. I'm 59 now, and I've hiked countless trails since then. I've seen bears, mountain lions from a distance, all kinds of wildlife. Nothing has ever made me feel the way I felt that day. It wasn't just fear. It was this overwhelming sense that I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to see. Something that existed in the shadows of our world, rarely glimpsed by human eyes. I still hike in those mountains sometimes, but I've never gone back to that specific trail. Not out of fear exactly, but out of respect. That space belongs to whatever it was we saw that day, and I don't need to intrude on it again. I've never been able to explain what we saw. I've read books about Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings over the years, and some descriptions match what we saw pretty closely, but I don't need a label for it. I know what I saw, and it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal officially recognized by science. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep at night, I can still see it, standing there across the creek watching us with those deep-set eyes, before turning and walking up that impossible slope like it was nothing. And I wonder if somewhere in those mountains, it remembers us too. Story 14. I've been sitting on this experience for almost a year now, and I still don't know what to make of it. Part of me wants to forget the whole thing happened, but I can't. It's like it's burned into my brain. I've told a couple close friends, but they just gave me that look. You know the one, like I'd completely lost my mind. Maybe I have, but I know what I saw. This happened last summer, in July of 2023. I was driving through northern Louisiana, heading from Arcadia toward Gippsland on this lonely 2-lane highway. It was mid-afternoon, maybe around 3 or 4 o'clock. The sun was still high, but it was that brutal Louisiana summer heat that makes the air above the road shimmer. I had the AC cranked up, listening to some podcasts to keep me company. I should mention I'm not some conspiracy theorist or cryptid hunter. Before this, if you'd asked me about Bigfoot, I would have laughed it off. Just another campfire story, right? I'm a pretty rational guy. I work in IT, for crying out loud. My life revolves around logic and troubleshooting. Anyway, I was about 40 minutes into my drive when something caught my eye off to the right. Just a flash of movement along the tree line that runs parallel to the highway. At first I thought it was probably a deer, or maybe a black bear. They're not super common there, but not unheard of either. What made me pull over was how odd the movement looked. Not like any animal I'd seen before. It wasn't the smooth bound of a deer or the lumbering gait of a bear. It was something else entirely, something that moved upright. I'm still asking myself why I pulled over. Curiosity, stupidity, both probably. I remember putting on my hazards, checking my mirrors. There wasn't another car in sight, and pulling onto the shoulder. The rational part of my brain was saying, "Cameron, what the hell are you doing?" But I ignored it. I got out of my car but stayed close to it. The air hit me like a wet blanket, that thick, heavy Louisiana humidity that makes your clothes stick to your skin instantly. I could hear cicadas going crazy in the trees, almost deafening. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just scanning the tree line. Nothing. I was starting to feel like an idiot, about to get back in my car, when I saw it again. Movement between the pines, maybe 50 yards in. My heart started hammering in my chest. I took a few steps toward the tree line, shielding my eyes from the sun with my hand. That's when I saw it. I don't know how else to describe what I was looking at except to say it looked like a young Bigfoot. I know how that sounds, believe me. But it was standing there, partially hidden behind a pine tree, watching me. It was shorter than I'd always imagined Bigfoot would be, maybe 5 feet tall at most, but its proportions were all wrong for a human. Its arms hung down near its knees, and it had this patchy, reddish-brown hair covering most of its body. The hair wasn't thick and uniform like you see in those fake Bigfoot photos. It was uneven, thinner in some spots. Its face is what really got me. It had this large head with a sloped forehead, and these eyes that were aware. That's the only word I can think of. They weren't animal eyes. There was intelligence there, curiosity even. For what felt like forever, we just stared at each other. I was frozen in place. My mouth had gone completely dry, and I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. But weirdly, I wasn't afraid. Not yet. It was more like shock, disbelief, like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. The creature shifted its weight, moving slightly behind the tree, but still watching me. I remember noticing its movements were fluid, not jerky or awkward. I took one step closer, and it didn't run. It just tilted its head slightly, like it was trying to figure me out as much as I was trying to figure it out. That's when everything changed. From deeper in the woods, I heard it. A deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the air around me. It wasn't like any animal sound I've ever heard. Not a bear, not a cougar, nothing I could identify. It was lower, more powerful, and it held this unmistakable anger. The younger creature's head snapped toward the sound, and its whole demeanor changed instantly. Its shoulders hunched, and without another look at me, it turned and disappeared into the trees with surprising speed. I should have left right then. Every instinct was screaming at me to get back in my car, but I stood there paralyzed, staring at the spot where the smaller creature had vanished. That's when I saw it. The adult. It emerged just enough for me to make out its massive form, half hidden in the underbrush maybe 75 yards in. This thing was enormous. I'm 6 feet tall, and this creature would have towered over me by at least 2 feet, maybe more. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, and even from that distance, I could see the muscle definition under its dark hair. The hair looked similar to the younger ones, but darker, almost black in some places. It didn't fully emerge from the trees, just enough to make its presence known, to warn me. Its face was partially shadowed, but I could make out its eyes clearly, fixed directly on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They weren't curious like the younger ones. They were threatening. It let out another growl, deeper and louder than the first, and I swear I could feel it in my chest. That's when primal fear kicked in, the kind that bypasses all rational thought. My legs started moving before my brain could even process the command. I scrambled back to my car, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. I remember looking in my rearview mirror as I pulled away, half expecting to see that thing charging out of the woods after me, but the tree line remained still. I drove well over the speed limit for the next 20 miles, constantly checking my mirrors. My heart didn't stop racing until I hit the outskirts of Gippsland. That night at the hotel, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I'd seen over and over. I convinced myself that I must have seen some bears. Maybe a cub and its mother, or possibly people in ghillie suits playing a prank. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The next morning, I started researching. I felt ridiculous typing Bigfoot sightings Northern Louisiana into Google, but what I found made my blood run cold. There were reports from that exact stretch of highway describing exactly what I had seen. Creatures with sloped heads, long arms, massive bodies. The details matched up too perfectly to be coincidence. Some reports even mentioned the reddish-brown coloration I'd seen on the younger creature. I kept digging and learned that the area is actually perfect for something like this to remain hidden. It's crisscrossed with small creeks and has sections of really dense forest that hardly anyone ventures into. There are swampy areas where the ground is too unstable to walk on, natural barriers that would keep people out. The thing that keeps haunting me is the intelligence I saw in those eyes, especially the younger one. It wasn't looking at me with fear, but with curiosity, like it was studying me. And the way the adult stayed back, only showing enough of itself to issue a warning that speaks to a level of strategic thinking that honestly terrifies me more than the physical appearance. I've gone back and forth about reporting what I saw to someone official, but who would I even tell? The local sheriff, some wildlife agency. They'd think I was crazy or looking for attention, and part of me worries about what might happen to these creatures if people believed me. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was a heat-induced hallucination or my brain misinterpreting something ordinary. But then I remember those eyes, that growl that seemed to vibrate through my entire body, and I know what I saw was real. I haven't driven that stretch of highway since, and I don't plan to anytime soon, especially not alone, and definitely not with plans to stop. Whatever lives in those woods wants to be left alone, and I'm more than happy to oblige. I've spent hours trying to convince myself that there has to be a logical explanation, but I'm running out of alternatives that make sense. It's not like I want to believe I saw Bigfoot and its child. That makes me sound insane. But when I run through every other possibility, nothing fits what I witnessed. The most unsettling part is that I now drive around wondering what else might be out there that we don't know about. What other creatures might be living alongside us, just out of sight, watching us from the shadows of the woods as we go about our lives, completely oblivious. I still get chills thinking about it. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, thinking I can hear that deep growl again. I know it's just my imagination, but the memory is so vivid, it feels like it just happened yesterday. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I probably wouldn't believe it either if someone told me this story. But I know what I saw that day on that lonely stretch of Louisiana highway, and it has fundamentally changed how I see the world. Some things just can't be explained away, no matter how much we want them to be. Story 15. I've never really told this story to anyone outside my family. It happened when I was 12, back in late November of 2003. And even though it's been 20 years, I can still remember every single detail like it was yesterday. I'm shaking a bit as I type this out. I grew up in a family of hunters in East Texas. My dad had taken me hunting since I was about 8, but this was the first year I was allowed to go out on my own with a rifle. We were staying at this small hunting cabin outside of Woodville that belonged to my dad's friend, Dr. Mitchell. The property had about 60 acres of thick hardwoods, perfect for deer hunting. That morning, Dad decided to stay back at the cabin because his knee was acting up again. He helped me pack a small backpack with some water, beef jerky, and a walkie-talkie. I had my dad's old Remington 30-06 rifle, which was honestly still too big for me, but I was so proud to be carrying it. The plan was simple. I'd head out to this wooden tree stand about a quarter-mile from the cabin. It wasn't anything fancy, just some wooden planks nailed to a big oak tree about 10 feet off the ground. It overlooked a small clearing near an old logging trail where deer would often cross in the early morning or late afternoon. It was cold that morning, probably in the low 40s, and there was this weird fog hanging low on the ground. I remember my breath making these little clouds as I walked through the woods. Everything was quiet, except for the sound of leaves crunching under my boots and the occasional bird call. I reached the tree stand around 6:30 in the morning, just as the sky was starting to lighten up. Climbing up was always a bit scary. The wooden ladder was old and creaky, and I had to be careful not to bang my rifle against the tree. Once I got up there, I settled in, propped my rifle against the rail, and just waited. Anyone who's been hunting knows that most of it is just sitting still and waiting. I sat there for about an hour, not seeing anything except a few squirrels. The woods were starting to wake up, and the fog was burning off as the sun rose higher. I was starting to get a bit bored and was thinking about eating some of my jerky when everything suddenly changed. There was this crashing sound from the woods to my right, and I froze. A moment later, a doe burst into the clearing, running faster than I'd ever seen a deer move. She wasn't just trotting, she was in full-on panic mode, her eyes wide, legs pumping frantically. Something was chasing her. My first thought was that it must be a coyote, or maybe even a mountain lion, though those are pretty rare in our area. I raised my rifle, thinking I might get a shot at whatever predator was after the deer. But what came out of the woods next? I still have trouble explaining it. At first, I thought it was a man. It was running on two legs, following the deer's path. But as it moved further into the clearing, I realized it was no man. This thing was huge. I mean, way bigger than any person I'd ever seen. It was covered in dark, shaggy hair, and its arms, God, its arms were so long, swinging as it ran. The creature was chasing after the deer with these massive strides, covering ground so fast it was terrifying. The doe disappeared into the brush on the other side of the clearing, and the thing followed right after it. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than 5 or 6 seconds, but time seemed to slow down as I watched. I sat there in the tree stand, completely frozen. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't even lift my rifle. Part of me wanted to radio my dad, but I was afraid to make any noise. Another part of me thought I must have imagined it. Maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. But I knew that wasn't right. Bears don't run like that. I decided to wait a few minutes to make sure the coast was clear before climbing down. That's when I felt it. A sensation of being watched that was so intense it made the hair on my neck stand up. Slowly, I turned my head to look behind the tree stand, and there it was, standing about 20 feet away from my tree, just staring up at me. I'll never forget what I saw. This thing was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It had a massive chest, broader than any bodybuilder's, covered in black hair that seemed a bit thinner around the shoulders and face. Its head had this weird shape, kind of peaked at the top, not round like a human's, but it was the eyes that really got to me. They were dark, almost black, and they were locked directly on mine. There was intelligence there, not animal intelligence, but something else, something that understood exactly what I was and what I was doing there. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, though it was probably only a few seconds. Then it made this sound, not quite a roar, but a deep, rumbling growl that I could feel in my chest. It was so loud and so powerful that I swear I could feel the tree stand vibrate. I could see every detail of its face. It had this flat, tan-colored nose, and its face was, it's hard to describe, like half human, half animal. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, and even from where I sat, I could see the enormous muscles rippling under its hair. It wasn't just big, it was powerful. After what seemed like an eternity, it finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the thick brush. It didn't run or seem scared. It just left, like it had decided I wasn't worth the trouble. As soon as it was out of sight, panic took over. I nearly fell out of the tree stand trying to get down, dropping my backpack in the process. I didn't even care. All I knew was that I needed to get back to the cabin, back to my dad, as fast as possible. I hit the ground and just started running. I had the rifle clutched in my hands, but I wasn't even thinking about using it. I just ran, following the path back toward the cabin. That's when I heard it, crashing sounds in the brush to my left, moving parallel to me. It was following me, not showing itself, just staying hidden in the thick undergrowth, but definitely keeping pace with me as I ran. I remember thinking, this is how I die. My legs were burning, my lungs were on fire, but pure terror kept me going. The sound kept pace with me, sometimes getting closer, sometimes fading a bit, but always there. In desperation, I stopped, raised my rifle and fired a shot into the air, hoping the noise would scare it off. For a moment, the woods went completely silent. Then the crashing sounds started again, still following me. I don't know how long I ran. It couldn't have been more than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Finally, I saw the cabin through the trees. I sprinted the last 100 yards, screaming for my dad the whole way. I burst through the door, slammed it shut behind me, and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. My dad jumped up from his chair, completely shocked. I was crying, trying to explain what had happened between gulps of air. He grabbed his shotgun and went to the window, looking out into the woods. Of course, there was nothing there. Whatever had followed me had stayed back in the tree line. Dad tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just a bear, or maybe even my imagination. But I knew what I had seen. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a costume. It was something else entirely. We packed up and left that afternoon. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder the whole time we were loading the truck, expecting to see that thing watching us from the trees. Dad was worried about me, but still seemed skeptical about what I'd seen. A week later, Dr. Mitchell, the owner of the property, came by our house. Dad had told him about my bear encounter, and I overheard them talking in the kitchen. I snuck closer to listen. Dr. Mitchell was telling my dad that he'd found some strange footprints near his lake the previous summer. Huge prints, like nothing he'd ever seen before. He said a few other hunters had reported odd things over the years. Strange sounds at night, feeling watched, finding trees snapped in half in ways no normal animal could do. That's when I knew for sure what I had seen was a Bigfoot. I know how that sounds. If someone told me this story, I'd probably think they were making it up or had seen a bear and panicked. But I know what I saw. I've done a lot of research since then. I think these creatures move around in small groups, never staying in one place too long. They're smart enough to avoid people most of the time, but sometimes, like that day in the woods, paths cross. I still go hunting, but never alone. And I've never gone back to those woods near Woodville. Sometimes I still have nightmares about those black eyes staring at me, about that feeling of being followed through the forest. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear that deep, rumbling growl outside my window. I don't expect everyone to believe me. I probably wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't lived through it. But I know what I saw that day, and no one will ever convince me otherwise. 20 years later, and I still get goosebumps every time I hear branches breaking in the woods. Story 16. I've been putting off writing about this for a long time. 6 years to be exact. I'm still not sure what to make of it, but after seeing that news report about a possible Bigfoot sighting near Zavala last week, I finally decided it's time to share what happened to me. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar. This happened in early October of 2016. I'm an avid runner, have been for most of my life. Back then, I was logging about 50 miles a week, usually splitting my runs between mornings and evenings. I had my regular routes mapped out around town, and one of my favorites was this quiet backcountry road that winds through some dense woods about 2 miles from my house. That morning started like any other. I woke up around 5:30, had my usual pre-run banana and coffee, stretched for about 15 minutes, and headed out the door just as the sky was starting to lighten. It was one of those perfect fall mornings, crisp air, around 50 degrees, with that earthy smell that comes after a light rain the night before, the kind of morning runners live for. I started with my usual warm-up pace down my street, turned onto Oakley Road, and then hit the main intersection where the backcountry road begins. This is where things get weird. About a quarter mile past the intersection, I started to hear something in the woods to my right. At first, I didn't think much of it, These woods are full of deer, raccoons, and other wildlife. But after another few hundred yards, I realized whatever was making the noise was keeping pace with me. When I sped up, it sped up. When I slowed down, it slowed down too. I remember feeling the first tingle of unease crawl up my spine. I've encountered animals on my runs before, dogs mostly, sometimes the occasional fox, but they either run away or come right up to the road. They don't shadow you from just inside the tree line. I should mention that the terrain on that side of the road isn't easy to navigate. It slopes down pretty steeply in places, with gullies and thick underbrush. Not something a deer would typically parallel for any distance. It would go down into the valley or up to higher ground. And it definitely wasn't a dog. There was no barking, no excited crashing through the brush. Whatever this was moved with purpose, deliberation. That's what really started to freak me out. I remember checking my watch. It was just after 6 in the morning, and I'd gone about 1.5 miles along the backcountry road. There are a few houses scattered along this stretch, and I noticed that whenever I passed one, the sounds would stop. As soon as I reached the next wooded section, they'd start again, like whatever it was knew to be quiet when there might be other people around. At one point, I came to a small clearing and decided to stop and pretend to tie my shoe just to see what would happen. The woods went completely silent. I stood up and started running again, and within seconds I heard it moving again too. The sound wasn't loud, just subtle movements through leaves and brush, but definitely something big. Way bigger than a raccoon or fox. I picked up my pace, pushing myself to about an 8-minute mile, which is pretty quick for me on a training run. Whatever was tracking me had no trouble keeping up. In fact, it seemed to move more smoothly at this faster pace. The really unsettling part was how it navigated that difficult terrain without making much noise. No stumbling, no breaking branches, just a steady, controlled movement through the underbrush. Something that big should have been making a lot more noise. About 3 miles in, there's a section where the road curves sharply and the woods come right up to the edge. As I approached this bend, the sounds suddenly got closer, like whatever it was had cut the corner through the woods while I had to follow the road around. For a split second, I thought it was finally going to show itself. My heart was pounding, and not from the running. I felt exposed and vulnerable in a way I'd never experienced before. I'm not a small guy, I'm 6'2" and in good shape. But in that moment, I felt like prey. Just as I rounded the bend, I heard what sounded like heavy breathing, not like a dog panting, but deep, controlled breaths. It was maybe 15 feet into the woods, just out of sight in the early morning light. I couldn't see anything through the thick trees, but I could sense it was right there, watching me. I'm not ashamed to admit I nearly pissed myself. I sprinted the next half mile, pushing well beyond my normal pace. My lungs were burning, but there was no way I was slowing down. And here's the thing that still haunts me. It kept pace, effortlessly. Whatever it was fast. There's a stretch of road about 4 miles in, where the woods recede, and there are open fields on both sides for about half a mile. As I hit this section, the sound stopped. I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see something emerge from the tree line, but there was nothing. Just the empty road behind me and the fields on either side. I used this opportunity to catch my breath and try to make sense of what was happening. Was I imagining things? Was it just some local guy playing a prank? But how could someone move through that rough terrain so easily and quietly? And why would they be out there at 6 in the morning? I considered turning back, but that would mean going past whatever had been following me, and there was no way I was doing that. So I kept going, hoping the open stretch would continue all the way home. No such luck. After the fields, the woods return on the right side for another 2 miles before you reach the turnoff to my neighborhood. As soon as I reached the trees again, I heard it. It had either run ahead through the fields without me seeing it, or it had been waiting. Neither option was comforting. At this point, I was genuinely scared. The sun was up now, but the woods were still dark and shadowy. I could hear cars on the main road in the distance, which offered some comfort, but I was still alone on this stretch with whatever was tracking me. I decided to try something. There's a small pull-off about half a mile ahead where people sometimes park to hike into the woods. I sprinted to this spot, then abruptly stopped and turned to face the woods. I shouted, "I know you're there. What do you want?" The woods went dead silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just absolute stillness. I stood there for what felt like minutes but was probably only 30 seconds, staring into the trees, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever had been following me. Then I heard it. A deep, low sound that wasn't quite a growl, but definitely wasn't human. It seemed to come from about 20 yards into the woods, and it raised every hair on my body. I've been in the presence of bears before while hiking, and this wasn't that. This was something different. I didn't wait around to find out what made that sound. I turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life. My lungs were screaming, my legs were on fire, but pure adrenaline kept me going. And the whole time, I could hear it keeping pace just inside the tree line. The thing that struck me most was the intelligence behind the movements. It wasn't just blindly chasing me, it was studying me, keeping itself hidden, adjusting to my speed and direction, almost like it was curious. As I approached the final mile before my neighborhood, the road widens and there are houses on both sides. As soon as I reached this area, the sounds stopped completely. I kept running until I reached my driveway, then practically fell through my front door and locked it behind me. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a bear, but bears don't typically follow people for miles without making themselves known. A mountain lion? Same problem, plus they're rare in this area. A person who could navigate that terrain so smoothly and quickly. I didn't run that route again for months. When I finally worked up the courage to go back, I brought my neighbor's German Shepherd with me. Nothing happened that day, or any day since. But I still get that crawling feeling on the back of my neck whenever I pass certain sections of those woods. I never reported it to anyone. What would I say? Something followed me in the woods, but I never saw it. I'd sound crazy. But after seeing that Bigfoot report last week from just a few miles away, I can't help but wonder if that's what was tracking me that morning. I still run those roads several times a week, but always with the dog now, and never in the early morning when it's dark. I've never heard those sounds again, but sometimes when I'm passing those same woods, I get the distinct feeling that something is watching me from just beyond the trees. Whatever it was that followed me that October morning, it was big, it was fast, and it was smart. And the scariest part? I think it could have caught me if it wanted to. Instead, it seemed content to just observe, like it was studying me. I still don't know what to make of the whole experience. All I know is that something was out there that day, something that doesn't fit into my understanding of the world. And sometimes, when the wind is right and I'm alone near those woods, I swear I can hear deep, measured breathing just beyond the tree line. Story 17. I've always considered myself an experienced camper. Growing up in Washington State, I practically lived in the Cascades during summer breaks. My cousin Derek and I have been camping together since we were kids, so when we planned a quick 2-day trip to Lake Wanachi in August of 2017, it felt like any other outdoor adventure we'd done 100 times before. Man, I wish I could go back and warn myself. We arrived at the campsite around noon on a Friday. The weather was perfect, not too hot, clear skies, just a light breeze coming off the lake. We found a nice spot under some towering pines about 70 yards from the water, far enough from the more populated camping areas to give us some privacy, but not so remote that we'd be completely isolated. At least that's what I thought at the time. Setting up was routine. We pitched our 4-person tent, built a decent fire ring with rocks we gathered, and unpacked our gear. Derek brought his new tackle box he'd been bragging about for weeks, and I had my trusty fishing rod that had served me well for years. We spent most of the afternoon fishing, catching a few decent-sized trout that we cleaned right there by the lake. Nothing seemed off at all during the day. We saw a few hikers in the distance, heard some birds, spotted a deer at one point. Totally normal forest stuff. We cooked the trout over the fire for dinner, along with some canned beans and potatoes we'd brought. Derek made his famous camp coffee, which is basically just regular coffee, but somehow tastes better when you're outdoors. We talked about work, relationships, the usual stuff. I remember checking my watch around 10:30 and suggesting we turn in since we wanted to get an early start hiking the next day. The first strange thing happened around midnight. I'm a pretty light sleeper in the wilderness. Years of camping has taught me to stay somewhat alert, even when I'm asleep. I woke up to what sounded like low grunting noises coming from the direction of our fire pit. At first, I thought maybe it was a bear searching for food scraps, which would have been concerning enough. We'd secured our food in the bear-proof cooler and hung our trash from a tree branch like you're supposed to, but bears can be persistent. I nudged Derek, but he just mumbled something and rolled over. The guy could sleep through a tornado. I lay there listening, trying to figure out what I was hearing. The grunting continued, but it didn't sound exactly like a bear. It was deeper, almost like someone with a really deep voice clearing their throat repeatedly. Then the sound started moving. Whatever it was walking around our campsite. I could hear pine needles crunching under heavy footsteps, and I mean heavy. Each step seemed to make the ground vibrate slightly, not like an earthquake or anything dramatic, but enough that I could feel it through my sleeping pad. That's when I started getting really scared. The footsteps circled our campfire area a couple of times, and then, I swear I'm not making this up, they came directly toward our tent. I was frozen, barely breathing. The thing stopped right at our tent flap. I could hear it breathing, slow and heavy. There was this smell too, hard to describe but unmistakable. Kind of like wet animal fur mixed with something sour and musky, not like any bear or deer I've ever smelled. I remember lying there, my heart pounding so hard I was sure whatever was outside could hear it. I had my pocket knife clutched in my hand, though what good that would have done against something that sounded that big, I don't know. The thing just stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. Then it grunted again, louder this time, almost like it was testing our reaction before moving away toward the lake. I didn't sleep another minute that night. I just lay there listening until the sounds faded completely. Eventually, the sky started lightening, and I immediately shook Derek awake. He thought I was crazy until we stepped outside. There, pressed into the soft layer of pine needles around our campsite, were footprints. Not bear prints, not deer. Footprints. Human-like but massive, easily 16 inches long and proportionally wide. They made my size 11 boots look like a child's in comparison. The stride length between them was insane, like 4 or 5 feet apart. But that wasn't all. Our cooler, which we'd left on the picnic table, had been knocked to the ground. The hard plastic was dented inward on one side, with what looked like claw marks scratched into the surface. Whatever had done this had tried to get into our food, but failed to breach the bear-proof latch. Derek wanted to leave immediately. I did too, if I'm being honest. But we'd driven 3 hours to get there, and I kept trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just a particularly large black bear. Maybe the footprints only looked human-like because of how they pressed into the pine needles. I convinced Derek to stay the second night as planned, promising we'd keep close to camp and be extra cautious. We spent the day fishing again, but our hearts weren't in it. We kept looking over our shoulders, scanning the tree line. Neither of us wandered far from camp. As the afternoon wore on, we gathered twice as much firewood as we normally would. By nightfall, we had built a fire twice the size of the previous nights, hoping it would keep away whatever had visited us. We sat up later too, talking in low voices, both of us clutching our camping gear like weapons. Derek had his hatchet across his lap, and I kept a large stick close at hand. Around 11, we finally crawled into the tent. The though neither of us changed into sleep clothes. We even kept our boots on, just in case. I must have dozed off, despite my fear, because the next thing I remember is Derek shaking me roughly. "Jake," he whispered urgently, "it's back." It was around midnight again. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see the immediate area around our tent. We could hear branches breaking in the woods about 30 yards away, roughly in the direction of the lake. It wasn't subtle either. These were loud cracks, like something big was moving through the underbrush with little concern for stealth. Then the rocks started. Small ones at first, pebbles really, landing near our tent. Then larger ones, some hitting our fire ring with metallic clinks, others thudding against the ground. One struck Derek's chair and knocked it over. This wasn't random. Something was deliberately throwing rocks at our camp. "We need to get out of here," Derek whispered, his voice shaking. I nodded, but we were both paralyzed with fear. The tent suddenly felt like the flimsiest protection imaginable, but at least it was something between us and whatever was out there. The rock throwing stopped. For about 30 seconds, there was complete silence, not even normal forest sounds. Then we heard footsteps again, heavier than the night before, moving purposefully toward our camp. "The fire," I managed to say. "We need light." We unzipped the tent as quietly as possible and slipped out, Derek clutching his hatchet while I grabbed the longest burning stick from the fire pit. I blew on the embers and added some kindling, praying the flames would catch quickly. They did, illuminating our small clearing just as the footsteps reached the edge of the trees. That's when I saw it. God, even now, 5 years later, I can still see it perfectly in my mind. It stood just beyond the full reach of the firelight, but visible enough to make out its massive form. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 9 or 10 feet. Its body was covered in thick, dark hair, not like fur exactly, more like a shaggy human hair, but all over. The musculature underneath was powerful. I could see muscles bulging in its arms and chest that made my gym-trained cousin look like a child in comparison. But it was the face that haunts me, not quite human, not quite ape, but some terrifying combination of both. Its eyes caught the firelight and reflected it back like burning embers. And when it opened its mouth, I could see yellowish teeth bared in what looked like a threatening grimace. It made that grunting sound again, but louder now, almost like a warning. Derek and I stood side by side, weapons raised uselessly before us, completely frozen in terror. The creature, because what else could I call it, took one step forward into the firelight. Then it did something I'll never forget. It deliberately stomped one foot on the ground, hard enough that I felt the impact through my boots while staring directly at us. It was a challenge, a threat, a territorial display. I don't know exactly what, but it broke our paralysis. "Run!" I shouted, and we both turned and sprinted down the trail toward where we'd parked the truck, about a quarter mile away. I could hear it behind us, crashing through the trees parallel to the trail. It wasn't on the path itself, but moving through the forest alongside us, keeping pace effortlessly. It was so fast, too fast for something that size. The sound of breaking branches and heavy footfalls seemed to be all around us, like it was trying to herd us or cut us off. I've never run so fast in my life. My lungs were burning, branches whipping across my face as we tore down the trail. Derek was a few steps ahead of me, and I kept expecting to feel a massive hand grab me from behind at any second. Somehow, we made it to the truck. Derek fumbled with the keys while I kept watching the tree line, the hatchet still gripped in his hand. We could hear it moving just inside the forest edge, still keeping pace with us. The truck started on the first try, thank God. We threw ourselves inside, locked the doors, and Derek floored it, gravel spraying as we fishtailed onto the access road. I kept looking out the back window, expecting to see the creature burst out of the trees and chase us down the road, but it never appeared. We didn't speak until we hit the highway. Even then, it was just Derek saying, "What the fuck was that?" over and over, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. What was it? I've spent 5 years trying to come up with an explanation that makes sense. A bear walking on hind legs? No way. The proportions were all wrong. And the way it moved was nothing like a bear. Some guy in a suit. The height, the strength, the speed all make that impossible. I know what we saw. Anyone who's spent time in the Pacific Northwest has heard the stories. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. I never believed those stories before, but I do now. The size, the appearance, the behavior. It wasn't trying to eat us or our food. It was driving us away from its territory. Neither of us has been back to Lake Wanachi since. I've barely gone camping at all, to be honest. Derek moved to Arizona last year, said he needed somewhere with fewer trees. I don't blame him. Sometimes I think about reporting what happened, but who would believe us? What proof do we have? We left everything at the campsite, the tent, our fishing gear, all of it. We just ran. Part of me wants to go back, just to see if our stuff is still there, or if there's any sign of that creature. The smarter part of me knows better. I don't know why I'm sharing this now. Maybe I just need someone to believe me. Maybe I need to stop carrying this alone. All I know is that something is out there in those woods, something that doesn't want us there. And if you're planning a camping trip to Lake Wanachi, maybe reconsider, or at least don't stay for a second night.